The lie you've been told about the One Piece world. The biggest lie in One Piece is not that the treasure is friendship, it's that this is a pirate world at all, because as far as the story is concerned, we're just sailing around on the corpse of somebody else's planet-sized science project. The Grand Line is not a fun adventure map. It's the fracture pattern of a deliberately sabotaged super-civilization, and almost everything we see is the rusted aftermath of a lost technological golden age. People like to say, One Piece is just goofy pirates with magic fruit, to which I say, mate, you're watching a series where a robot from the future island runs on mystery fire from 900 years ago, and the government is so scared of history, they literally orbital strike librarians. This is not normal ocean behavior. This is what a cover-up looks like when it has a weather system. Here's an interesting thing. The ancient kingdom is usually framed as just the political rival that lost to the 20 kings, but the more crumbs Oda drops, the less that makes sense. This wasn't just a country. It was the architect of a completely different global system. Geography, energy, bloodlines, even the climate were engineered on purpose. And to be fair, that sounds insane. Until you remember, we already have sky islands, weather machines, and a guy casually controlling sea kings with her voice. The world government does not just fear the name of that kingdom, they fear the memory of how the world used to work. Imagine seas that were actually stable continents, that were unified instead of chopped into 4 quadrants by a random stone wall, clean ancient energy powering cities instead of burning slaves and sunlight, and a social order where the idea of celestial dragons being gods is physically impossible because the whole system is built to make that kind of hierarchy break. So what are we doing in this video? We are going full conspiracy. Corkboard. We're going to reconstruct the Void Century timeline as best we can. From poneglyphs, O'Haran notes, and those weird little asides, Oda hides in SBS corners. Then we dissect the ancient kingdom's technology and culture from Skypiea carvings to Egghead blueprints, to Fishman Island's apology letter from Joy Boy. We break down the 3 ancient weapons, plus this vague but terrifying thing Vegapunk calls ancient energy. We dig into the D-clan and lineage factors as leftover code from the old world. And finally, we zoom all the way out to the original geography of the planet, and how someone quite literally engineered the Grand Line as a lock on reality. Stylistically, we're going fast, but methodical, playfully analytical, because this is a mess of tiny lore crumbs, and I want to emphasize the goal is to connect them into one coherent old-world model, not just yell Void Century every 5 minutes. And if you think this is all too galaxy brain, remember the Calm Belt, the Red Line, even the Going Merry's little Klabouterman. Those are not just cute world-building details. Those are fossils of old systems we were never meant to notice. The biggest lie isn't about the ancient kingdom itself. It's about what the world government did to the planet to erase it, and that starts with rethinking the map we've been staring at since Chapter 1. Rebuilding the Void Century, a timeline. The story won't hand you. So if the map is a crime scene, the Void Century is the missing security footage. The story will never just play that tape for us, to which I say, fine. We'll reconstruct it like deranged YouTube detectives with corkboards and red string. The problem is baked into the narrative and the meta. In story, the world government literally executes people for asking what happened 800 years ago. Out of story, Oda drip feeds us lore through poneglyph scavenger hunts, O'Hara flashbacks, Joy Boy apology letters, and Vegapunk TED Talks. We're not getting a neat chapter titled Void Century for Dummies. We have to reverse engineer a 100-year war from scattered black boxes and one very emotionally damaged Sea King princess. So, baseline. Before the Void Century even starts, the Ancient Kingdom is not some scrappy rebel island. It's already a mature super-civilization. Egghead-tier tech is just their consumer electronics. Global influence, a shared language system sophisticated enough to encode history into indestructible stone, and a philosophy that clearly clashes with the ancestors of the 20 kingdoms. O'Hara concluded this great kingdom was the enemy of the world government, which, if you think about it, implies parity. You don't rewrite the planet to erase a minor annoyance. Here's an interesting thing. If we zoom out, a rough sequence actually starts to form. First, the ancient kingdom rises and builds a global network. Alliances with clans like the Kozuki, contact with Fishman Island, probably even with sky races and giants. Then, ideological and resource conflict with the 20 kingdoms brews. Think shared world versus controlled world, freedom versus hierarchy. That escalates into deployment and counter-deployment of ancient weapons and weird energy systems Vegapunk keeps almost naming. After that, we hit catastrophic war, the kind that doesn't just kill nations, but literally reshapes seas and climate. Finally, the surviving 20 kingdoms crown themselves the world government and start the systematic erasure of everything that came before. Because as far as anchors go, we actually have a few. We know the government is about 800 years old. We know multiple poneglyphs are scattered in the most hostile places on Earth, deep in the Grand Line, in Sky Islands, in a Yonko's basement, at the bottom of the sea. We know Joy Boy leaves an apology to Poseidon on Fishman Island about a promise tied to destroying the Red Line and uniting the seas. And we know O'Hara died, convinced that the great kingdom opposed the founders of the government. I want to emphasize how the poneglyphs make this feel like a long resistance, not a sudden game over. The Kozuki clan forging indestructible stone records during an active purge, that's wartime black box behavior. You only build that if you expect your cities, your libraries, and your entire information system to be wiped. The fact that those stones also hold ancient weapon coordinates suggests a coordinated, if we lose, here's the reboot key contingency. And to be fair, the scale of damage implied is way beyond Big Cannon Go Boom. The calm belt, the Grand Line's insane weather, the four seas split by one random continent wall. This feels like a planet that's been manually patched together. The war probably involves systems, weather control grids, sea level manipulation, maybe even full-on planetary engineering. The current climate chaos reads like the leftover bugs of a broken terraforming update. So for now, lock in this draft timeline on an invisible 100-year calendar. Rise, conflict, weapons, cataclysm, cover-up. As we move into ancient tech, bloodlines, and geography, we're going to keep pinning new events onto that timeline until the Void Century stops being a black box and starts looking like a storyboard someone tried very hard to burn. The Ancient Kingdom, not a nation, a global operating system. And this is where the usual fan take kind of breaks. People love to say, the Ancient Kingdom was just a super country that lost, to which I say, that's like calling Windows that one laptop in the office. If this thing really scared 20 kingdoms into a permanent NDA, we're not talking about a nation, we're talking about a global operating system the whole planet was quietly running on. Because as far as behavior goes, the Ancient Kingdom doesn't act like Wano 2.0. It acts like a backbone service. Poneglyph script is standardized. The iconography is standardized. Their enemies have to erase every island that remembers them, as if they're scrubbing a protocol, not just a flag. You don't commit to a 100-year delete key unless the original install was everywhere. Here's an interesting thing. Egghead basically confirms this. Vegapunk, the smartest guy alive, says his tech is still behind the old world, behind a civilization that no longer exists. That implies a baseline, planet-wide standard of high-end tech, shared energy systems, automated infrastructure, information storage that can survive Sea Kings, Buster Calls, and Oda's schedule. Punk Records feels like a tiny, glitchy replica of whatever cloud the ancient kingdom was running. Skypiea quietly functions as our case study. Shandora's Golden Bell, the Poneglyph, the ruins in the clouds. These are not random sky people doing Etsy stone carving. The blocks, the engravings, the motifs all match ground-level poneglyph sites, which means the ancient kingdom had outposts or allies literally above sea level, plugged into the same cultural and technological network. Sky, surface, probably undersea. Fishman Island's poneglyph ties Joy Boy's promise directly into the future destruction of the Red Line. That's not local politics, that's OS-level patch notes. And I want to emphasize the cultural layer, because this is where the software metaphor really starts cooking. Joy Boy's relationship with the first Poseidon, the apology to Fishman Island, the recurring sun symbol in Nika, the Shandians, and slave resistance, that all reads like a unifying ideology, freedom of movement, equality between races, open seas instead of gated routes. It's less, we rule you, and more, we maintain the network so everyone can sail, which is exactly why this system was incompatible with the proto-celestial dragons. Their entire power structure is built on artificial scarcity, controlled routes, and information monopolies. If everyone has access to safe passage, clean energy, and unfiltered history, what are you selling as a god? What do you gatekeep? You can't role-play divinity when the OS keeps auto-updating people's freedom. So the ancient kingdom's real power was soft power. Technology standards like the Poneglyph script, shared trade routes, maybe even a global energy grid. That's influence without occupation. Not an empire, but a dependency. Everyone relied on the system, which means when you decide to uninstall it, you can't just conquer. You have to rewrite the world. And when they ripped that backbone out, what did we get? Grand Line madness, isolated cultures, tech regression, and a world map that looks like someone rage quit and built a prison on the crash screen. Next, we're going to tie that uninstall directly into the Red Line, the ancient weapons, and why the current geography feels like a bug report someone turned into a religion. Ancient tech wasn't magic, it was a different physics engine. So if the current world is a crashed program, we should talk about the hardware it was running on, because as far as tech tiers go, One Piece is a complete mess in the funniest way possible. On one end, you've got East Blue, sailboats, cannons, Usopp duct-taping explosives together like a gifted 8-year-old. Then you jump to Marineford, and suddenly the world government is calling in Buster Calls like it's a naval nuke button. Add pacifistas, laser cyborgs mass-produced off one guy's body, and the scale already feels whaled. And then Vegapunk shows up and makes all of that look outdated. Egghead is basically an Apple store built on a death laser. We have light-speed transport tubes, holograms, weather control domes, Seraphim, and now the Mother Flame, which is literally labeled ancient energy but make it modern. Vegapunk is the smartest man in the world, and even he is clearly cosplaying as the old world instead of actually matching it. Here's an interesting thing. The series keeps implying the ancient kingdom wasn't just more advanced, it was running a different physics engine. Not just better gadgets, but a unified energy paradigm that could power weapons, cities, maybe even climate systems without the usual trade-offs. No coal, no sea stone, no "my ship can't sail without wind" nonsense. Just plug into the grid. The best smoking gun is that ancient robot from Egghead. 200 years ago, it climbs the red line. No food, no crew, just pure purpose, attacks Mary Joyce, and then runs out of power and shuts down for 2 centuries. Vegapunk dissects it, worships it, still can't turn it back on. Then Luffy starts banging the sun god Nika drums, and the robot literally cries and moves. People want to say fantasy magic, to which I say Oda is screaming, "This is a system" at us. Will, sound, and energy are obviously linked, and if you have near-limitless clean energy, a bunch of other fantasy stuff suddenly looks like engineering. Stable flight. Sky Islands stop being miracles and start looking like leftover infrastructure. Weather manipulation? That's just a global version of Egghead's climate dome. Mass automata production? The robot is probably one of many, not a one-off mascot. Reshaping land masses or sea levels without explosives? That's how you carve a red line or flood a continent without leaving obvious craters. I want to emphasize how physical the poneglyphs are in this. These are indestructible blocks of stone carved with microscopic precision that have sat in the ocean, under islands, inside ancient temples for 800 years without eroding. Current shipwrights can't scratch them. World government weapons can't chip them. That's not just language preservation. That's material science and tooling, so advanced it might as well be a save file chiseled into reality. People will say, "It's just fantasy. Stop trying to science it." And to be fair, we are absolutely galaxy-braining a comic about rubber pirates. But Oda loves internal logic. Devil fruits have categories. Hockey has a taxonomy. Lineage factors are basically gene code. Treating ancient tech as a coherent mystery _box _ technology isn't overthinking. It's playing the same game the story is. Which brings us to the real monsters, the ancient weapons. Next, we're going to argue that Uranus, Pluton, and Poseidon aren't random superweapons at all, but specialized user interfaces for that lost energy grid, and that the world government's real fear isn't the weapons themselves, but someone turning the whole system back on. Ancient energy, the missing fuel that powered a planet. So if the ancient weapons are the user interfaces, we kind of have to ask the horrifying IT question: what was the operating system? What was the actual battery you could plug a continent into? That's where this vague, fan-made label, ancient energy, becomes really useful, because as far as the text goes, Oda is screaming, there is a missing fuel type without naming it. Here's an interesting thing. Every time we see old-world tech, the problem is never complexity, it's power. The Egghead robot isn't broken, it's out of juice. Vegapunk doesn't brag about inventing a new reactor. He's depressed that he can only imitate a fragment of something older. So when we say ancient energy, we're talking about a hypothetical, insanely high density, basically clean energy source that the ancient kingdom used to run robots, weapons, probably climate systems, maybe even the original sea-level control. Vegapunk can describe the idea, but he literally cannot reproduce the source. So, he cheats and makes Mother Flame. And to be fair, Mother Flame is already a war crime with branding. On Egghead, We see three pillars: the energy-starved robot, Vegapunk's tiny artificial son, and the world government quietly going, "We will be taking that, thanks." That tells us two things. One, the archetype of this power system is known in high circles. Two, actually accessing the real thing is impossible, so they're burning a synthetic knockoff that still punches holes in countries. Now, why does this feel weirdly biological? Because the robot wakes up to Luffy's Nika heartbeat. It doesn't respond to voltage, it responds to rhythm, to the drums of liberation, to a sun god motif baked into its OS. That's not just a battery, that's a story-powered engine. Devil fruits are already concepts turned into powers, and lineage factors are basically genetic source code. Put those together, and you get a civilization that probably learned to convert will, narrative, and identity into literal output. You believe in the sun god hard enough, the grid turns on is dumb as a science sentence, but terrifyingly coherent as one-piece logic. I want to emphasize how modular this would have been. City cores running off central reactors, mobile platforms like Pluton and Uranus acting as roaming output nodes, biological interfaces like Poseidon, where a single mermaid princess can command sea kings because she's effectively a living admin account. It's not three random superweapons, it's a seamless tech biomythology ecosystem riding on one lost power curve, which is exactly why recreating it now is catastrophic. The current world's geography, sea levels, even political borders are calibrated for scarcity and fragmented seas. Turning Old World wattage back on without Old World safeguards is like plugging your studio apartment into a star. Lulucia is our tutorial level. Emu presses a button, Mother Flame feeds something orbital or space-based, and an island is erased with a beam that looks suspiciously like a focused ancient energy strike. But dumber, less efficient, purely weaponized. People say, "Okay, it's just a super laser," to which I say, "Mate, your super laser doesn't rewrite cloud formations and maybe the sea floor." If this energy once powered not just weapons, but the literal shape of the oceans, then the fall of the ancient kingdom stops looking like a normal war and starts looking like someone forcibly shutting down the planet's operating system. And if that's true, the real endgame question isn't who fires Uranus, it's what actually happens when Joy Boy hits the power button again. Uranus, Pluton, Poseidon, not weapons, system admin keys. So when the series keeps yelling ancient weapons in big scary font, we all default to nukes with extra steps. Giant cannons, city deletion, boom, done. To which I say, that's kind of the most boring possible read. Because as far as what we actually see on page, these things behave way less like superguns and way more like root passwords for the planet. Take Poseidon. The story literally tells us it's not a machine. It's a title that reincarnates into a mermaid who can command sea kings. On paper that sounds like summon kaiju, profit. But here's an interesting thing. The first concrete thing we see those sea kings do is not rampage. They tow Noah, gently, coordinated. That's not a riot, that's logistics. These things are living infrastructure, the ocean's automated cranes and tugboats. And Poseidon is the user interface. If they can move Noah, they can move anything. Routes, currents, maybe even whole island rafts. That's maritime traffic control, not just bite ship, ship go sink. I want to emphasize how weirdly responsible this looks. Fishman Island's poneglyph ties Joy Boy's promise to the eventual destruction of the Red Line and the unification of the seas. You don't do civil engineering surgery on the planet by just yelling, "Sea Kings, go wild." You need a system that can reroute migration paths, reshape trade winds, and keep the food chain from becoming a complete mess. That's Poseidon's job description, accidentally cosplaying as a doomsday button. Then we get Pluton, which sounds much more straightforward, warship that can destroy an island in one shot. Cool, big gun, very subtle. And to be fair, Water 7 treats the blueprints like they're holding Satan's USB stick, but the details are off if it's just a boat. The thing is supposedly buried in Wano's very geology, tied into the country's isolation and those ridiculous waterfalls. We're talking about a ship whose true body might be the landmass itself. Imagine a mobile dry dock fused with tectonic livers. Raise borders, drop islands, vent magma. Weaponize it if you're stupid. Island busting is then not the feature. It's the catastrophic misuse of a land management system, which leaves Uranus, the big question mark, and also, probably, the scariest if you point it the wrong way. The Lulutia erasure looks like someone clicked Delete City from orbit. Combine that with a sky god name, and you get a pretty obvious category: atmosphere and orbital space. Weather, air currents, maybe floating platforms that channel ancient energy as precision beams, climate control as a menu, not a miracle. In the old world, these three read less like separate superweapons and more like a distributed admin panel: sea, land, sky. Regulators that kept an engineered planet stable while still serving this joy boy philosophy of open routes and free travel. In a war, you just flip the sign. Ocean routing becomes tsunamis. Tectonic scaffolding becomes island killers. Climate balancing becomes endless storms over enemy capitals. That scale of repurposed maintenance power actually matches the void century being so bad it had to be deleted. And if that's right, the current world suddenly looks like a janky physical patch. The red line as a hard wall where you used to have software limits. Calm belts as training wheels replacing real ocean management. Marine routes as manual, bureaucratic pathing where Poseidon once handled traffic automatically. The world government doesn't have the keys, so it rebuilt the lock around the planet instead, which raises a nasty little question for later. What happens to that prison map the moment someone logs back into the original system? Why the world government fears a memory, not a weapon. Which is why the world government's real nightmare isn't Poseidon logging in again. It's everyone else realizing the current OS is a janky trial version. People think they're guarding against 3 big nukes, to which I say, mate, you don't buster call a library because you're scared of a cannon. O'Hara is the cleanest example. You do not mobilize an entire fleet to vaporize one tree and some professors because they might accidentally summon Pluton on their lunch break. You do it because those nerds were about to say the quiet part out loud, that this world map, this social system, this age of piracy, is not the natural endpoint of history. It's a patch. The moment an average citizen hears, hey, 800 years ago, they had clean energy, no red line choke point, and actual global coordination, the whole "this is the best we can do" story starts to wobble. Here's an interesting thing. The 5 elders never act like normal wartime leaders. They act like overworked forum mods. They're not just deleting weapons, they're deleting threads. Names like D get scrubbed. An entire island like Lulusia gets hard uninstalled from the map. Imu hoards a single giant straw hat like it's a banned symbol. That's not battlefield strategy, that's fear of narrative contagion. Because as far as authoritarian control goes, stories are a worse virus than any ancient weapon. Weapons you can hoard, point, or break. Memories of a different social contract? No celestial dragons, no slave collars, no Holy Land on a cliff literally above everyone else? That stuff lives in people's heads, and you can't confiscate a mental image at the harbor. I want to emphasize how unstable that makes the system. If even one version of "we used to live better than this" spreads, suddenly the world government isn't a guardian against chaos. It's the downgrade. That's why the poneglyphs are such a problem. They're not just a scavenger hunt for Pluton coordinates. They're a distributed archive of the ancient kingdom's name, its allies, its promises. Fishman Island stone doesn't say, "Here's a gun." It says, "Here's a failed promise about destroying the Red Line and uniting the seas." That's ideology, not artillery. And to be fair, if you're sitting on a fake throne in Mary Joyce, ideology is the one thing you can't aim a battleship at. So the world government builds a substitute mythology, the empty throne to pretend no one rules. The big reverie meetup of 170 nations to cosplay shared power, while the Gorosei literally sit above them. The void century turned into a cultural taboo where asking, "What happened?" is basically heresy. All of it is set dressing to make this version of reality feel inevitable and eternal. Fans love to say they're scared of being blown up. Sure, on the surface, but the deeper terror is being compared to a remembered golden age and losing the argument instantly. And this is where it gets nasty, because they're not just suppressing history in books. When we get to the D-clan and lineage factors, we'll see they're actively hunting the bloodlines that can embody that old world memory just by existing. What happens when your very DNA is treated like contraband ideology? The original map, why the current seas, make no sense. What happens when your DNA is contraband? You don't just rewrite the history books. You literally remodel the planet so nobody can even retrace the route that history took. And that's where the map of One Piece quietly starts screaming at us. Because as far as world building goes, this thing is a mess. You've got a single continuous continent, the Red Line, wrapping the entire globe vertically like someone put a belt on sideways. Then, slicing that in half, you have a single equatorial sea, the Grand Line. And then, flanking that, you get calm belts that are just windless Sea King buffets. This isn't a map, it's a puzzle box. On a realistic planet, that configuration is actually absurd. One mega-continent running pole to pole would wreck plate tectonics, ocean currents, and climate. You'd get nightmare weather, not 4 comfy blues where people casually fish and argue about pirates. And to be fair, One Piece has never pretended to be a geology textbook, but Oda is annoyingly specific about currents, wind, and log poses. He wants you to treat this as a functioning system, which makes it way more suspicious that it only functions if someone designed it. Here's an interesting thing. The Red Line doesn't just sit there looking dramatic. It behaves like a political wall. It slices the 4 blues apart, so east can't just sail to west. All meaningful crossing is funneled into a handful of choke points: Reverse Mountain, the Holy Land at Mary Joyce, and the deep-sea route through Fishman Island. If you want to move between hemispheres, you're basically speed-running a world government checkpoint. Reverse Mountain is a natural roller coaster that just happens to spit you into the Grand Line. Mary Joyce sits on the only known surface bridge. Fishman Island is the underwater tunnel. 3 doors to the entire planet. That is not an accident. That is level design. Then you add the calm belts as a secondary lock. No wind, no currents, just colossal sea kings waiting to treat your ship like a breath mint. Casual crossing is suicide. Suddenly, the Grand Line becomes this gated highway, only accessible if you have warships, sea stone-lined hulls, or enough insane skill to brute force the rules. The map itself is enforcing a social hierarchy, so we float a heretical idea. What if this wasn't always the case? The simplest void century hypothesis is that the Old World seas were way more open and continuous, with no red line at all, or at least a drastically different landmass layout. That fits an ancient kingdom obsessed with freedom of movement and shared seas. You can't sell all the world is one ocean if your planet is literally a crosshair. And I want to emphasize, the vertical stuff gives this away. Skypiea shows us sky islands with their own weather, dials, and history. Fishman Island is a full civilization under crushing pressure, sitting right beneath a poneglyph that talks about destroying the red line and uniting the seas. The world has always been three-dimensional. We're just stuck on the broken middle layer. So the question becomes, what kind of war is big enough to carve a scar around the entire planet and lock the oceans into a prison grid? In the next sections, we're going to try something mildly insane. Step by step, we're going to reconstruct the Old World's geography and see how an actual battle could terraform an entire planet into propaganda. Before the red line, reconstructing the Old World's shape. So if the current world is a prison grid, we kind of have to ask the obvious follow-up. What did the planet look like before somebody wrapped barbed wire around it? Because as far as geology goes, a single, uniform, planet-spanning wall is about as natural as Eni's Lobby's bottomless pit. The red line does not behave like a normal continent. It's too tall, too consistent, too conveniently wrapped around the entire globe, like someone selected extrude on the world map. That screams artificial, or at least heavily modified. You do not get Reverse Mountain and Maria Joa and Fishman Island all stacked in one neat vertical axis without some lunatic geoengineering project powered by ancient weapons plus whatever ancient energy Oda's been teasing. So, let's roll the clock back and imagine the Old World. Instead of one wall continent, picture multiple big landmasses and messy archipelagos, more like a slightly cursed version of our own Earth. East-west travel would have been way more direct. You wouldn't need suicidal climbs up Reverse Mountain or government-regulated undersea elevators just to visit your grandma on the other side of the planet. Trade routes, migration, culture, all of that flows when the map isn't literally a maze. Here's an interesting thing. Sanji's all-blue dream. People treat it as pure fairy tale, to which I say, in this series, the fairy tales keep turning out to be redacted history. A sea where fish from all four blues coexist implies that, at some point, those ecosystems weren't hard segregated by a giant stone firewall. Either the oceans were unified, or at least the borders between blues were porous enough that life mixed freely. The red line reads like a later patch that broke the original system. Now drop Fishman Island into that mental image. It sits directly under Marie Joie, functioning as the only legal undersea crossing between the first and second halves of the Grand Line. That feels less like natural wonder and more like someone slammed a new ceiling onto an existing deep-sea highway and left a single hatch in the middle. You want to move armies, trade, or refugees through the depths? Cool. Enjoy your one controllable hub populated by a persecuted race. Sky Islands crank this up. We've got ancient ruins above the clouds, giant beanstalks, and the knock-up stream, which is basically the ocean rage quitting gravity, that doesn't feel like slow, cozy plate tectonics. It feels like chunks of the old world were blasted upward during the war. Reverse Mountain is the same vibe. 4 seas flowing up into a single peak and then down into the Grand Line is hydrologically absurd unless the entire river and sea level layout was forcibly reconfigured. I want to emphasize what that means ideologically. A world of open routes and interconnected seas naturally supports a Joy Boy-style freedom-centric philosophy. You can't easily monopolize information or bloodlines when ships, fish, and people can literally go anywhere. So, if you're 20 kings trying to erase a super-civilization, what's the perfect tool? You build a global wall, lock the currents, and turn geography itself into propaganda. In the next section, we'll zoom in on who had the power to press that planetary reformat button and why the world government is still terrified someone might undo it. Engineering a prison planet, how the new seas were built. So once you've hit the planetary reformat button, you don't just walk away and hope for the best. You patch the OS. You install DRM on the oceans. And that's basically what the post-void century world looks like. Not just a victory screen, but a hard-coded prison update. After the ancient kingdom falls, those 20 kings have a problem that every final boss secretly has. What if the sequel happens? As far as raw power goes, they've just survived a fight with a civilization that could talk to sea kings, launch continent-killing battleships, and engrave unbreakable stone. You don't beat that and then trust vibes. You need a control grid. So the proto-world government doesn't just found Marie-Joie. They start literally restructuring the planet so that no Joy Boy 2.0 can ever move armies or ideas the way the old world did. Here's an interesting thing. If you already have ancient weapons and ancient energy lying around, geology stops being sacred and starts being a UI element. Pluton is a warship that can erase islands. Scale that up, chain it with multiple hulls, and you're not sinking land. You're uplifting plates, fusing fragments, welding a jagged super ridge that becomes the red line. Then add Uranus, the sky weapon. If it can manipulate weather on a national scale, why not ocean currents? You lock heat flows, redirect gyres, and suddenly you've drawn a perfect ring of nightmare sailing conditions we call the Grand Line. The calm belts are where this goes from cool sci-fi to this is a war crime. 2 windless strips, perfectly hugging the Grand Line, packed with sea kings like a living minefield. Natural, to which I say, natural my ass. If Uranus can freeze atmospheric circulation in those bands, and Pluton's collateral shock waves scramble deep currents, you get stagnant, warm waters that are basically Sea King Airbnb. No wind, no safe crossing, unless you have sea stone hulls or government tech. That's not a quirk of nature, that's a lock on the prison door. And the Grand Line itself? Everyone treats it like a fun pirate obstacle course because as far as story tone goes, it is. But in universe, it's a trauma scar. Intersecting currents, brutal temperature gradients, magnetic fields so cooked you need special log poses just to not die. That's what happens when you brute force a new circulation system into place with God weapons and leave the atmosphere to figure it out. I want to emphasize how ugly that is. This isn't a whimsical D&D map. It's a post-war engineering mess. Now look at marine infrastructure once you accept the prison planet idea. G1, G5, Amy's Lobby, Impel Down, Marineford's old location, the Holy Land, perched right on the Red Line. These aren't random cool bases, they're keys on the grid, Every legal route between blues, every safe red line crossing, every stable current is choked by a government island or gate system. Moving an army without permission is logistically nightmarish by design. And to be fair, that's the point. The old world was open source seas. The new world is DRM locked water, which circles us back to the D clan. If the current map is a man-made cage, then the people whose blood, memory, or inherited will still remembers the pre-cage configuration are walking bugs in the code. They're the ones who don't emotionally accept the walls. That's exactly the kind of person you label a natural enemy of the gods, when your entire regime is built on keeping the patch from ever being rolled back. So who exactly had the authority to aim Uranus at the sky and Pluton at the crust, and whose descendants are still paying the bill for that shot? The will of D, old world root access in human form. The answer, weirdly, is the same people. The story keeps quietly flagging with one random letter. The Ds are basically the human error message the world government can't uninstall. Canonically, we don't know much, which is Oda speak for we know a lot if you're willing to be insane about it. They're scattered everywhere. Luffy the pirate idiot, Garp the marine hero, Dragon the revolutionary, Roger the pirate king, Teach the walking bug report, Rouge and Ace, even kings like Riku Dold and Nefertari Lily. Different nations, different social classes, different politics. But every time that middle initial shows up, we get the same pattern. Defiance, laughing or smiling at death, and this repeated line that they're natural enemies of the gods. You don't call someone that because they jaywalked in Marie-Joie. The usual take is secret bloodline, to which I say, kind of, but not in the neat anime chart way, because as far as the text shows, the D are a distributed legacy, not a pure clan. They look like descendants, allies, and ideological carriers of the ancient kingdom, scattered by war and intermarriage. Think less Uchiha, more diaspora. Pockets of people who kept fragments of an ethos and maybe some firmware updates, even as they blended into the wider population. And here's an interesting thing, that ethos is always tied to the sun and freedom. Nika the sun god, the drum of liberation, Luffy literally turning into a cartoon sun man whose power is make everyone free and stupidly happy. The D's instinctive pushback against oppression, the way celestial dragons and Gorosei get visibly rattled when the name comes up. That's not just politics. That smells like a surviving cult of the old world's core symbol, the sun as raw, unfiltered access to reality. I want to emphasize how physical this might be. Vegapunk tells us about lineage factors, the genetic code of living things. What if the D aren't only ideological heirs, but people whose lineage factors still carry specific old-world patterns, markers that play nicer with ancient energy, or with certain devil fruits, or with the awakening toggle on world-shaping abilities? Look at the examples. Luffy's Nika fruit doesn't just awaken, it rewrites the rules of his reality into rubber logic. Law's Opa Ope no Mi can theoretically grant immortality and do surgery on concepts. Blackbeard's body is so anomalous, he can host multiple fruits and eat reality like it's a side dish. These aren't just strong powers, they're powers that treat the world's physics as optional DLC. And to be fair, Sengoku basically spells out that this freaks the government out. His warning about the D spreading through the world and needing to be watched, the quiet tracking of every D name, the erasure of Nefertari Lily from history. It starts to look less like political paranoia and more like a targeted effort to to find and delete anyone still carrying Old World root access, which raises the next problem. If the D are running around with legacy admin keys in their DNA, what exactly is a lineage factor, and how much of it is just a dumbed-down, post-apocalypse version of the ancient kingdom's original bioengineering toolkit? Lineage factors, the Old World source code for life. So, lineage factors, One Piece's way of saying DNA. But in the same way, a sea train is just a boat that decided rails were a personality trait. On paper, it's the genetic blueprint of living beings. In practice, it's Oda's root folder where he dumps every weird biology idea that shouldn't work, but absolutely does. Canon first. Vegapunk, Judge, and Queen treat lineage factors as editable code. We literally watch Judge mass-produce Germa soldiers by copying the same bloodline factor. Vegapunk grows full-on human clones like Stussy from scratch. And the Mads crew figure out how to hijack animal traits to make artificial Zoans. Caesar's SAD, Smiles, the Seraphim fusing Lunarian durability with Warlord templates. This is all the same system. You tweak the lineage factor, you don't just get a haircut, you get a new species. And to be fair, these guys are doing it in a post-apocalypse lab situation. Vegapunk is out here running a planet-changing R&D department on a budget the world government treats like a vague suggestion. If modern scientists, with half their data redacted and their funding committee made of literal celestial dragons, can still copy devil fruit abilities and mass-produce Lunarian light child soldiers, what was the ancient kingdom doing when they actually understood the original specs? Because, as far as we can tell, the old world wasn't just good at science, it was living in a different tech tier. So here's an interesting thing. What if devil fruits themselves are not wild magic, but consumer-grade biosoftware? Crystallized programs that overwrite or patch your lineage factor with a new form, power, or concept. That's why a fruit can be copied into an artificial Zoan, why powers can migrate when a user dies, why Kaku's giraffe and Spandam's sword elephant feel like badly installed mods. You're installing an oldworld.exe into your body. People say, that sounds too sci-fi for One Piece, to which I say, we already have laser-shooting cyborg bears and a talking skeleton with a soul return cooldown timer. The series passed the sci-fi exit 3 arcs ago. Once you frame lineage factors as code, the D-clan starts looking less like a random bloodline and more like a deliberate fork. Their absurd resilience, freakish willpower, and that weird magnetism to world events, this might be old world firmware. Maybe they were tuned to survive high-energy environments, interface with ancient tech, or resist certain forms of mental and ideological control. A population designed to keep the system honest, that the world government has been trying to uninstall ever since. Lunarians and fishmen then stop being wacky fantasy races and start reading like case studies. Flame-backed sky people adapted to thin air and solar exposure. Underwater-optimized humanoids built for deep-sea pressure and aquatic communication, directly tied to Joy Boy's promise and the future destruction of the Red Line. I want to emphasize how systematic that feels. It's like the old world ran a full planetary beta test on what humans could be. And now? The pacifistas, the seraphim, bloodline factor theft. This is the world government speedrunning that lost discipline, but only the parts that make better guns. Where the ancient kingdom probably tried to tune life around the planet, the government is tuning life around Marijoa, which loops us back to ancient energy. If you can write lineage factors like code, why not engineer living conduits? Sea kings that sense Poseidon, trees like Adam and Eve that drink up impossible stress, maybe even specific human lines that stabilize or unlock planetary energy flows. The question is, what happens when that whole living circuit gets turned back on at once? Bloodlines. Before the throne, pre-government clans and castes. If the planet is a giant living circuit, then the old world basically min-maxed the character creator. They didn't just build reactors and robots. They bred whole peoples as specialized plug-ins. That sounds creepy and eugenicsy, to which I say, yes, exactly. That's why the world government is so terrified of this era coming back online. Because as far as we can tell, the big old world bloodlines aren't just cool races. They're system roles. Take the Lunarians. King's race literally runs on fire, can survive any environment, and lived on a sky godland. That screams high-altitude infrastructure, solar collectors, weather regulation, maybe even direct maintenance of Uranus or other sky tech. When Vegapunk and the Gorosei obsess over Lunarian durability, they're not being random racists. They're trying to reverse engineer a lost admin class. Down below, fishmen and merfolk fill the opposite niche. Super strength underwater, natural sonar, and fishman karate that literally manipulates water molecules. That's not just martial arts flair, that's deep-sea engineering. Guardians of sea conduits, ancient energy intakes, maybe the original custodians of places like Fishman Island's poneglyph and the Sea King network around Poseidon. You don't put your ocean server room in the hands of regular humans with snorkels. Then you've got the Kozuki. These guys are not just traditional Wano nobles, they are explicitly the poneglyph craftsmen, indestructible data nodes, written in a script only certain lines can read and reproduce. That's conscious resistance, not passive survival. I want to emphasize, they chose a medium the world government literally cannot delete without rewriting the planet's geology. O'Haran scholars ID at least 30 of these things before getting nuked, and that's just the tip of the archive. The D-Clan feels like the ideological and maybe leadership core. People who carry the error in the system, the one variable the world government's rewrite couldn't scrub. They laugh at execution, topple regimes by existing, and keep popping up in key positions around ancient weapons and old-world sites. It's like the Great Kingdom hard-coded a roaming patch into specific bloodlines. Sky people like the Shandians are a weird hybrid case. They end up blasted into the sky and dispossessed of their land. But originally, they look like ground-level stewards of an ancient energy node in Shandora, later hijacked by Skypians and Enil. And to be fair, when your entire city gets yeeted upward by a knock-up stream, that is one way to forcibly scatter a user base. Here's an interesting thing with the three-eyed tribe. Their rumored awakening lets them hear the voice of all things. That sounds a lot like a built-in interface protocol. Imagine a caste whose whole job is to read poneglyphs, talk to sea kings, and negotiate with sentient superweapons. Suddenly, Pudding isn't just a tsundere gag. She's legacy hardware. Once you line all this up, the world government's treatment of these groups stops looking like vague fantasy racism and starts reading as a targeted deintegration of an old ecosystem. Lunarians get hunted into lab specimens, fishmen are shoved into a segregated undersea kingdom and legally downgraded, giants, buccaneers, assorted sky peoples, all fragmented, enslaved, or turned into rare commodities. The goal isn't just cruelty. It's to break the old world's modular coalition so it can never reassemble, which is where the Straw Hats accidentally speedrun treason. Luffy keeps befriending D's, fishmen, giants, sky people, a Kozuki heir, and now a potential three-eyed reader. At some point, you have to ask, is this just Oda collecting cool designs, or are we literally watching the ancient kingdom's original party comp reform in real time? Culture of the Lost Super-Civilization, Joy Boy, Nika, and the Sun. So if the Straw Hats are accidentally rebuilding the ancient kingdom's raid party, that raises a bigger, dumber question. What kind of civilization needs a crew like this? Because the stereotype is cold, hyper-efficient space, Romans with laser cannons. To which I say, where exactly in this series of rubber raves and skeleton concerts do you see a sterile utopia? When we actually glimpse the old world through Joy Boy and Nika, it doesn't feel like a boardroom, it feels like a festival. Joy Boy isn't remembered as Supreme Chancellor of Logistics. He's remembered for an apology. A promise to Fishman Island so emotionally loaded, it gets carved into an indestructible rock. Who does that? You only immortalize an apology if the original culture treats commitments to oppressed peoples as core infrastructure, not side quests. The fact that this failed promise still matters 800 years later tells us their moral system was built around uplifting the people everyone else treated as props. And then we layer Nika on top of that, the sun god of slaves, a laughing, stretching, dancing figure whose modern incarnation literally turns battlefields into parties. That's not just haha goofy shonen. That's a hero archetype where joy is a weapon, where the act of laughing in chains is a bigger middle finger to power than any sword. Because as far as the celestial dragons are concerned, the most dangerous thing a slave can do is smile like they're already free. Here's an interesting thing. That sun keeps leaking through the censorship. Shandians tatted on their backs. Fishmen branded over the scars of the hoof of the soaring dragon, literally overwriting the world government's ownership mark with a pre-government meme that says, "No, actually, I belong to the sky." The Revolutionary Army quietly recycles the same visual language. Different eras, same equation. Sunlight equals truth. The world government is the curtain. And then we get to the music. The drums of liberation, Luffy's heartbeat turning into this cosmic metronome that wakes up an 800-year-old robot. This is where the super-civilization stops being sci-fi chrome and starts looking like a carnival of science and myth. Old-world tech doesn't just run on uranium or whatever. It probably runs on rhythm, on shared cultural signals. I want to emphasize how insane that is. Your pacifista equivalent only boots when the party is good enough. People assume advanced civilizations are serious and sterile, to which I say, Oda looked at that idea and drew a god who fights like a Looney Tune. And to be fair, that's a much scarier rebellion template than any grimdark resistance. If joy itself is infrastructure, then destroying that world isn't just about sinking islands. You have to outlaw songs, rewrite holidays, swap a sun god for a blank, empty throne, and teach people to fear the sea instead of dance on it. Which raises the real horror question. How many of the modern festivals and stories we see are actually corrupted versions of ancient kingdom block parties, still hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to start the beat again? From Golden Age to Gilded Cage, founding the world government. So if the ancient kingdom was out here throwing sun god raves, the morning after is brutal. The war ends, and what's left? Not a clean victory royale, but a planet-sized hangover. Shattered islands, poisoned seas, climate patterns losing their minds, and whole races either wiped out or shoved underground. The 20 kingdoms don't step into a functioning world. They sprint into a burning server room and start yanking cables while yelling, "World Peace." because as far as PR goes, that's the move. You don't say, we just helped nuke a super civilization and stole their toys. You say, we're forming a council. Shared laws, shared security, a promise that nothing like the void century cataclysm will ever happen again. And to be fair, a lot of normal kings probably did buy into that. But the real architects, the proto-celestial dragons, are already carving out God's status, literally writing themselves as the only adults in a world of traumatized children. Here's an interesting thing. They pick Mary Joy's on top of the red line as HQ. That's not just a flex, that's urban planning as theology. The red line is the scar of the old world, the giant wall that shouldn't exist, and they sit on it like a crown. They control the only safe crossing between the blues, turn geography into a toll booth, and then into a throne. You want to move armies, trade, or refugees across this broken map? You kneel at the scar. And up there in their sky-gated community, they start curating the Museum of Stolen Future. Old world tech does not disappear. It gets privatized. Early pacifista-style concepts, knowledge that ancient weapons exist, maybe even partial access to that ancient energy we've been talking about, those get locked behind Holy Land paywalls. The rest of the world is allowed, even encouraged, to regress. Windmills and cannons for you, sun lasers and cloning labs for the guys in spacesuits. To make this palatable, they invent one of the funniest lies in the series, the empty throne. No one rules the world, they say. All kings are equal here, they say. To which I say, sure, and Eney's lobby is a quirky tourist trap. The empty throne is performative minimalism, a prop that says, see, no emperor, while Emu sits in the back room with the admin password, and the celestial dragons treat everyone else like NPCs. I want to emphasize how tight the censorship loop has to be for this to work. You outlaw void century research. You burn O'Hara the second they get close to mapping all 30 poneglyphs. You quietly restrict islands like God Valley, Lulusia, and whatever other old-world relics pop up, and you use the Marines as both cops and janitors. They're not just enforcing law, they're pressure-washing history off the pavement. And yet, the mess keeps leaking. Poneglyphs survive, ancient bloodlines survive, songs survive, which sets up where we're headed next. Now that we've sketched the upgrade from Golden Age to Gilded Cage, from energy grids to geography to bloodlines, the rest of this breakdown is going to crack each system open and follow how the Straw Hats, by sheer chaotic road trip energy, are accidentally rebooting the old world the government thought it deleted. Reverse engineering the old world map, what the seas used to look like. So if the government turned energy, bloodlines, and even religion into a cage, we kind of have to ask the obvious follow-up. What about the actual planet? Because as far as raw geography goes, the One Piece world looks less like a natural globe and more like somebody's cursed board game expansion pack. You've got 4 color-coded starter zones, 1 murder difficulty ring in the middle, and a big red "Do Not Cross" wall running pole to pole. That's not a continent, that's a DRM system. A normal ocean planet wants to be messy. Continents break up. Currents wrap around. You don't usually get a single uninterrupted land scar slicing the entire map in half unless someone with way too much power and not enough hobbies decided, what if we patch note the sea? Here's an interesting thing. Once you look at the canon geography, it actively fights the idea that this layout is natural. The calm belts are allegedly just no wind, tons of sea kings, to which I say, sure, and my Wi-Fi just naturally drops only when rent is due. 2 perfectly parallel, planet-encircling dead zones hugging the Grand Line like caution tape, full of monsters that conveniently punish anyone trying to bypass the official route. That's not weather, that's border control. Then there's Reverse Mountain, 4 different blues, all somehow feeding one mountain, all flowing uphill into a single summit river that then drops into the Grand Line. Hydrologically, that's fanfic. You basically need someone to grab the entire global water system and twist it into a funnel. And to be fair, Oda loves impossible islands, but this one is doing narrative work. It forces every major journey into the same choke point. Now, drop the all blue into this mess. Cooks treat it like a fairy tale. One sea where every fish species from every ocean coexists. But on a planet that's already mostly water, why is that so wild? The all blue isn't a dream sea. It's a fossil memory of the old world's normal ocean. Before the Red Line and the calm belts, before the Grand Line became a storm tunnel, the seas being interconnected wasn't a miracle, it was Tuesday. So what does that old world map actually look like? Strip out the continuous red line, break it into scattered continents and archipelagos, more like the Ring of Islands vibe we get from places like Wano or God Valley flashbacks. Imagine one global ocean where currents circulate instead of collide, where sea kings roam but don't get corralled into 2 monster highways, and where you don't need a log pose because magnetic fields aren't being jammed by some artificial weather system. I want to emphasize how much that instantly cleans up the lore. A unified sea explains how the ancient kingdom could build global infrastructure, why Fishman Island has a poneglyph about literally destroying the Red Line to reunite the oceans, and why modern navigation feels intentionally broken. It also reframes sea kings and the insane weather as side effects of a sabotaged planet, like the world's climate and fauna are still trying to run old world software on a hacked map. And once you accept that geography itself was weaponized, the world government stops being just a political villain and becomes a level designer, which sets us up for the next step. If they rewrote the oceans, what kind of civilization were they so scared of that they were willing to rewrite the entire void century to bury it? The Red Line as a man-made scar, terraforming on a planetary scale. If the world government are level designers, then the Red Line is their most broken map exploit. One continuous wall wrapping the entire planet like somebody rage quit tectonics and just drew a circle. Because as far as geology goes, the Red Line is nonsense. Continents don't politely form a perfect ring that just so happens to slice the oceans into 4 neat quadrants. You don't get a single uniform cliff, same color, same basic elevation, with 0 visible fault lines, and then also have the Grand Line running perfectly perpendicular like it's a UI grid. That's not plate tectonics, that's a UI designer having a bit too much fun with the symmetry tool. And to be fair, Oda could have left it as fantasy world, shut up. But here's an interesting thing. He keeps adding details that make the Red Line feel engineered. Reverse Mountain is the loudest one. 4 separate seas, all flowing uphill, converging at a single summit river, and then dropping into the Grand Line. People will say, oh, it's just a cool set piece. To which I say, mate, that's a planetary-scale plumbing system. Somebody installed that. That's a circulation pump for an artificial ocean layout. Then you crown that with Maria Joie right at the apex, like a control tower literally bolted onto the highest point of the ring. And under it, Fishman Island, crammed into a bubble cavern like an afterthought in the basement. It reads less like a natural undersea city and more like, We carved a tunnel through this megastructure and shoved the marginalized race down there. I want to emphasize how cruel that visual is. The gods on top of the wall, the fish people under the floorboards. So what made the wall? We've basically got two main ideas. Theory 1, the Red Line started as a deliberate terraforming project by the ancient kingdom. Maybe they were trying to stabilize rising seas, control currents, or build a unified transit ring, a kind of planetary dam system that got hijacked during the Void Century. Imagine a super civilization halfway through building their global infrastructure, and the 20 kings seize it, lock in an unfinished design, and then rewrite history so no one remembers the original blueprint. Theory 2. The Red Line is scar tissue, collateral damage from a superweapon event that cracked a former supercontinent and flash-forged this ring out of the wound. That would explain the uniformity. It's not a continent, it's cooled shrapnel. And suddenly, the ancient weapons stop being abstract nukes and start feeling like tools that can literally redraw coastlines. Either way, the political payoff is the same. The Red Line creates permanent choke points. Maria Joie, Red Port, the gates of justice. If you want to cross worlds, you either beg the world government for an elevator or risk the insane currents they control. It justifies the celestial dragons being above everyone because they physically are, and it hard-codes separation between peoples, races, and oceans into the map itself. And if one ancient weapon just happens to be perfectly described as something that manipulates the sky, the sea, and maybe even the land between them, well, that's a suspiciously good candidate for who swung the hammer on this scar. We'll talk about that one next. Pluton, the blueprint for breaking and building continents. And if Uranus is the hammer that stamped a scar across the sky, then Pluton is the chisel that lets you rewrite the planet afterwards. Nico Robin is not hunting a weapon of war. She's hunting a world map reset button, and I want to emphasize how insane that is if you say it out loud. On the surface, Pluton is simple. Legendary warship, built in the old world, blueprints hidden in Water 7 with Iceberg and Frankie, world government frothing at the mouth to get it, and a poneglyph in Alabasta pointing to it. Later we find out it's actually sleeping under Wano, which is already a mess of old-world symbolism, a closed samurai kingdom, ancient stonecraft, and a clan that literally invented the poneglyph system. People treat Pluton as just a super battleship, to which I say, cool. So the same regime that casually drops buster calls is terrified of a better buster call? Because as far as threat profiles go, that doesn't add up. The world government controls a planet-spanning navy, the Seraphim, Emu's mystery laser garden, and probably like 6 other living war crimes we haven't met yet. If all Pluton did was delete fleets, they'd want it, sure, but they wouldn't treat the blueprints like a world-ending taboo. What they're really protecting is their main asset, the engineered geography itself. The Red Line, the Grand Line, the 4 blues as separated biomes, that's their prison architecture. Here's an interesting thing. Fishman Island's poneglyph ties Joy Boy's promise to the destruction of the Red Line and the unification of the seas. That's not sink a few ships energy. That's press this, and the map stops being a cage energy. So Pluton-class tech starts to look less like a cannon and more like geoengineering hardware. Either it can shatter the Red Line, or it was part of the original construction and stabilization of that supercontinent. In both cases, the blueprints are literally an undo/redo button for the current world layout. And to be fair, Oda keeps teeing this up. Water 7 is a city that lives and dies by changing sea levels. Alabasta is a desert kingdom whose poneglyph quietly points at Pluton while its ruler refuses to use it. Wano is a country that used to sit at normal sea level, then got surrounded by towering walls of land and left submerged beneath an artificial bowl. At some point, someone didn't just move borders, they moved oceans. So when Odin talks about opening Wano's borders, what if that's not political, it's hydraulic? Those walls drop, the trapped water erupts, and suddenly you have a live fire test of Pluton-tier terrain editing. Wano becomes a preserved old-world fragment and a switch. Flip it, and you don't just free a country, you start rebooting the entire sea system. Which raises a nasty question. If Pluton is the reset button, what exactly was the ancient kingdom trying to reset to? Poseidon and the Sea King Network, the old world's ocean admin. So if Pluton is the reset button, the ugly follow-up is reset to what exactly? And here's an interesting thing. The story already gave us the user manual. It just disguised it as a crying mermaid princess who everyone treats like a walking natural disaster warning. Poseidon, on paper, is simple. It's the mermaid princess who can command sea kings. Shirahoshi cries, the ocean's biggest jump scare compilations show up, and the Gorosei instantly start sweating through their robes. Because as far as raw power goes, yeah, summoning a dozen continent-sized monsters is bad news for any navy that still believes in wooden ships. But I want to emphasize, the world government doesn't panic over simple firepower. They panic over systems, over things that can't be turned off once they're online. Look at how sea kings actually behave. These aren't random encounter mobs. They talk. They remember hearing Roger and Odin. They recognize that Shirahoshi hasn't awakened yet. They react to specific bloodlines like they're waiting for a password prompt. People like to say, "Oh, that's just Oda being whimsical with talking animals." To which I say, mate, your definition of whimsical is a distributed, centuries-long, cross-ocean memory network. Because as far as narrative weirdness goes, that's closer to cloud computing than to Disney fish. So the idea here is that Poseidon isn't just queen of the monsters, she's root access. In the old world, the Sea Kings were probably living infrastructure, a planet-wide ocean oasis. Need bulk transport before you invent sea trains? You schedule a Sea King convoy. Need long-range communication before Dendenmushi? You piggyback messages on a species that literally never forgets. Need climate regulation and current control to keep your unified sea stable. You adjust the behavior of the creatures that physically move water on a continental scale. It's less summon kaiju and more log into the admin panel for the planet's hydrological system. And to be fair, that suddenly makes Fishman Island look a lot less like a quirky detour and a lot more like a severed main hub. Buried 10,000 meters under the Red Line, right where all routes between Blues and Grand Line would naturally intersect, sitting on a poneglyph that talks about Joy Boy's promise to bring everyone to the surface and destroy the Red Line. What happens if the Red Line didn't exist originally? You get one continuous ocean, one continuous Sea King network, and a mermaid princess whose voice can propagate through that whole mesh with almost no friction. Cut the world with a giant stone firewall, shove Fishman Island under it, and suddenly the network is fragmented. Poseidon still exists, but she's like an admin locked out of half her own servers, which is exactly why the current regime wants her dead or controlled. If Pluton is the tool to physically undo the Red Line, Poseidon is the software key that tells the oceans what to become after the walls fall. But that creates a new problem. Why would a sea admin account be reborn cyclically in one bloodline? Why hard code that into reality? The answer lives in the D clan, lineage factors, and the ancient kingdom's weird habit of turning people into living system functions, which is where we're heading next. Uranus and the sky, weather weapons or planetary OS kernel. And if Poseidon is the ocean software key, then every tornado, sea king migration, and, oh look, the sky is on fire today, moment stops looking random and starts looking like lag. Like the planetary OS is trying to ping a server called Uranus and getting a 404 every few centuries. Because as far as canon goes, Uranus is almost offensively vague. It gets name-dropped once alongside Pluton and Poseidon. The Gorosei are terrified of it, and then Imu casually points at the sky and deletes Lulusia like they just closed a pop-up ad. People go, "That could be a new weapon, not Uranus," to which I say, "Sure, and I could be a Yonko if you squint hard enough." The series is screaming, "There is a sky-based superweapon that the throne fears," and then shows us a satellite-style strike from orbit. That's not subtle. Here's an interesting thing. We already know the sky in One Piece is not just decorative. Skypia gives us dials that store heat, sound, wind, literal impact, cloud roads that behave like programmable matter, and entire civilizations built on solid sky. That's not quirky fantasy. That's degraded infrastructure. It feels like we're walking through the broken Wi-Fi of the old world. The dials are like leftover peripherals from a bigger system, pieces of an API the current world only half understands. So imagine Uranus not as one big gun, but as the kernel of that sky system, a control node sitting in orbit or in the upper atmosphere, talking to sea clouds, island clouds, jet streams, maybe even the red line itself. You want to raise sea levels around an enemy kingdom? You push a patch. You want to starve a region or bless it with eternal harvests? You tweak climate permissions. Whoever owns Uranus doesn't just nuke nations. They decide which parts of the map stay habitable. And to be fair, Oda already quietly told us the sky has an off-world component. Enel's cover story is basically a lore bomb disguised as a gag. He flies to the moon, finds ancient ruins, sees murals of people of the sky arriving from space, and reboots a bunch of automata with some mysterious ancient energy. That is not myth. That is migration. The winged races, the dials, the cloud tech, all of it reads like imported hardware from a lunar or orbital civilization. So if the people of the sky came from space, Uranus starts looking like their root access. A planetary OS kernel bridging moon, upper atmosphere, and sea. You can even read Imu's attack as a restricted admin command. A precise column of light, weather going haywire around a single island, the world government staring at the map like a UI. I want to emphasize how terrifying that is next to Joy Boy, Poseidon, and the D-Clan. If one bloodline can talk to the oceans and another throne can rewrite the sky, then the Void Century wasn't just a war over land. It was a version control fight over reality itself. And we still haven't talked about who hard-coded those permissions into human genetics, which is where lineage factors and the so-called errors named D walk in. Ancient energy, the lost power source that makes devil fruits look cheap. So if Joy Boy, Poseidon, and the D-Clan are basically admin accounts, that raises a very stupid, very important question. What's the operating system? You don't rewrite oceans and sky on willpower alone, unless Shanks has been secretly plugged into a wall outlet this whole time. Here's an interesting thing. Every time One Piece pretends it's about ships and swords, Vegapunk walks on screen and accidentally turns it into a sci-fi energy crisis. He's obsessed with the fire of the sun. He builds the mother flame, a tiny vial of God battery. Pacifistas and Seraphim are so power-hungry they need entire islands as charging docks. And then we have random old-world artifacts that just keep working for centuries with no maintenance. Because as far as internal consistency goes, that's not steampunk. That's a missing energy paradigm. People will say, "Oh, it's just manga logic," to which I say, Oda does not accidentally run a global climate infrastructure joke for 25 years. The ancient kingdom wasn't flexing with stone blocks and funky fonts. It was running on a clean, near-limitless power source that made coal and dials look like rubbing sticks together. You don't geo-engineer seas, prop up sky islands, and build continent-busting weapons on wood fires. You do that with a planetary-scale energy system, quietly humming under everything. And to be fair, the series keeps screaming this in the background. Skypiea has an entire sky city powered by clouds and weird dials that feel like degraded peripherals. The ancient weapons are framed as living super machines. Even the red line itself starts to read less like a natural formation and more like a giant powered lock. The old world wasn't just advanced, it was embarrassingly advanced. Modern One Piece tech is that vague mess where a genius like Vegapunk is still reverse engineering scraps and calling it a miracle. Now connect that to the mother flame and Imu's island-erasing shot. Vegapunk synthesizes a tiny droplet of ancient energy, and suddenly the world government can yeet Lulusia off the map with what looks suspiciously like Uranus doing a system reboot. The important part isn't, "Wow, big laser." It's that the government clearly only has a fragment. One vial, one shot. They're hoarding it, terrified that anyone else might rediscover the full old-world grid and realize the rulers of the sea are basically cavemen with a stolen USB stick. I want to emphasize how neatly devil fruits slide into this. What if they're not the power, they're the interface? Consumer-grade biological apps that tap into a deeper planetary power grid the ancient kingdom actually understood. Logias as root access to elemental subroutines. Zoans as living firmware that can overwrite your body on command. Paramecias as weird plugins no one fully documented. The world government can clone Seraphim and mass-produce artificial fruits, but the best they manage are glitchy half-copies that still need external fuel. So what kind of civilization builds living apps that rewrite human bodies on a planetary network level? And who was in charge of editing the source code of life itself? That's where lineage factors and the genetic engineering of the old world start to look a lot less theoretical and a lot more like the real ancient weapon everyone's been ignoring. Lineage factors, the old world's open-source genetic code. So when Vegapunk starts talking about lineage factors, he's not just dumping sci-fi jargon. He's basically opening the settings menu of the planet. And then Oda immediately distracts us with a laser baby Seraphim so we don't ask follow-up questions. Classic. Here's an interesting thing. In story, lineage factors are explained as the blueprint of life. Vegapunk literally reads them, edits them, and prints new beings. That's how we get artificial Zoans, smiles, the green blood in the Seraphim, and every bloodline-based hack from Judge's raid suits to Sanji's exoskeleton finally booting up. People like to say, it's just DNA, to which I say, sure, and a devil fruit is just a snack. The whole point is that this isn't normal genetics. It's a programmable power system. Look at the use cases we already see. Vegapunk copies Kizaru's light powers onto pacifista lasers. He reverse engineers Kaido's fish fruit into Momo's artificial dragon. He bakes Lunarian traits into child clone war gods. The Seraphim are literally copy-paste Mihawk and Hancock running on a Lunarian OS with Devil Fruit plugins. As far as in-world tech goes, that's absurdly advanced. And to be fair, Vegapunk keeps calling his own work a failure, which is wild because he's casually doing what most sci-fi settings reserve for endgame gods. So if this is the crude, post-apocalyptic version, what did the polished release look like? Because as far as complexity goes, you don't jump straight to cross-species, cross-ability, multi-generational power inheritance without standing on a much older, cleaner standard. The Ancient Kingdom almost reads like the original GitHub repo of biology. Joy Boy and friends treating species and abilities as modular code, open source, shareable, forkable. And suddenly, a bunch of weird plot threads start lining up. Lunarians with their fire and flight toggled on by default. Giantification projects that the world government still can't stabilize. Fishmen and minks with baked-in environmental and combat buffs that look suspiciously like racial DLC from a previous age. Devil fruits that remember powers across centuries and respawn those abilities into new users like the server just reassigned a license key. I want to emphasize how weird that is. Reality itself is honoring an old-world software contract. Now, mini-hook time, Sanji's eyebrow. Everyone treats it as a gag, but what if that spiral is literally visible? UI, a barcode from Germa's old-world coding conventions. His siblings have matching swirls. Judge has a whole visual language of numbers and coils, and Sanji's eyebrow reversing post-awakening looks like a flag flipping from dormant to active in real time. That's not just character design, that's a debug screen, which is where the racial mess of One Piece becomes extra cursed. If the Ancient Kingdom's global OS once let people swap traits, share abilities, and upgrade bodies like open-source mods, then the current world's slavery, race hierarchies, and extinct bloodlines are basically a malicious corporate fork. The Celestial Dragons took a collaborative codebase and locked it behind a paywall of blood purity. So, if lineage factors are the commented-out code of that lost system, the real question is, who's about to uncomment it first? Vegapunk, Blackbeard, or Luffy's very illegal operating system called Joy Boy? The will of D, root access to the planet's operating system? So, if the Celestial Dragons are running a malicious corporate fork, the D-Clan are basically the unpaid open-source maintainers who keep breaking their app. The world government keeps trying to patch the system, and these guys just jailbreak reality. Because as far as patterns go, the Ds are kind of insane. They topple regimes, ignite eras, and every time one of them dies, they die smiling. Roger on the execution platform, Ace in Marineford. Even Saul in O'Hara, laughing as he drags a battleship. Who does that? People whose bodies are literally tuned to a different operating system. They're drawn to storms and the sea like magnets to a hard drive. Luffy's Logia-level relationship with weather. Blackbeard showing up with apocalyptic clouds. Roger sailing into the most cursed currents on purpose. And the world government's reaction is not subtle. Erase the D from the name. Never speak of this again. That's not normal paranoia. That's someone still has root access energy. Here's an interesting thing. If lineage factors are commented-out code from the old world, the D might be the last surviving admin accounts. The D isn't just a random middle initial. It marks people whose lineage factors are aligned with the planet's original OS. They unconsciously sync with ancient energy, attract allies like they're running a permanent Wi-Fi hotspot, and destabilize any rigid system they touch. Luffy walks into Alabasta, Enies lobby, Impel down, Wano. Every closed loop starts glitching. Law joins the worst generation, and suddenly the Heart Pirates are performing illegal kernel surgeries on souls. Even kids like Rouge and Garp bend history just by existing near this mess. I want to emphasize how many old-world touchpoints cluster around D-bearers. Gold D. Roger hears the voice of all things, sea kings, poneglyphs, even the very stones of the world are compatible with his drivers. That's not hockey as a simple power-up, that's OS-level audio. Luffy eats the Gomu Gomu fruit, which is actually Nika, which is actually an ancient sun god protocol, and when it awakens, the whole world's physics engine turns into Toon Force. Law gets the Op no Mai, the ultimate devil fruit, and his room is basically a dev console that lets him rewrite coordinates, hearts, memories. Teach, meanwhile, is the bug report made flesh, an anomalous body that can host multiple fruits, like a machine running two incompatible OSs at once without blue screening. People say the will of D is mysterious, to which I say, yes, but it's mysterious in a very specific way. It feels both genetic and mimetic, blood and story. The ancient kingdom seems to have embedded a dual-layer failsafe, a lineage factor flag in the body, and a mythic narrative flag in the culture. Even if the old world OS was wiped, the tales of a laughing rebel, a sun god, a joy boy would keep propagating the meme. Then, when someone with the right blood hears the right story at the right time, the reboot sequence starts. And to be fair, the first guy who almost hard reset everything wasn't Roger or Luffy. It might have been the walking jailbreak attempt known as Rox D. Zebek, but that's a pre-Roger horror show we'll dig into later. Joy Boy. Architect, user, or glitch in the old world system. Joy Boy is less a person and more a recurring software patch the world keeps trying to install, and the Void Century is what happens when your planet hits Update Now and the battery dies at 3%. Because as far as the story is concerned, Joy Boy is both a guy who wrote an apology letter and a metaphysical bug report on reality itself. So, what do we actually know? Fishman Island gives us the clearest snapshot. A poneglyph apology from Joy Boy to Poseidon, a promise tied to Noah, and sea kings literally saying, "We were waiting for the right era." The giant ark is parked under the red line like a moving van that never got used. The implication is wild. Someone scheduled a mass migration or sea level shift. The Sea Kings were the transport, Poseidon was the dispatcher, and Joy Boy was supposed to hit execute. He doesn't. Instead, we get, "Sorry, my bad, maybe later." That's not just a failed promise, that's an interrupted update. Here's an interesting thing. The story keeps stapling that unfinished script onto Luffy. Laugh Tale, the inherited will, the Nika fruit, the whole Bring the Dawn branding. Luffy is not framed as a conqueror. He's framed as a jailbreak. He doesn't want the throne. He wants to uninstall thrones as a concept. People say, "Oh, he's just the next Joy Boy," to which I say, no, he's Joy Boy 2.0 running on a meat-based operating system that barely remembers to eat. And to be fair, that's kind of the point. The will survives. The implementation keeps changing. So, what was the original implementation? Model 1? Joy Boy as literal king of the ancient kingdom. This is the clean fantasy novel answer. Big techno-utopia. king with a sun god brand, 3 ancient weapons in the garage, and a plan to flatten the red line, unify the seas, and give every race a fair shot. The world government hates this guy because he represents a competing sovereignty and a competing map. Model 2. Joy Boy as a symbolic title passed down to OS-level users. Not king, but root access. A role that gets bestowed when someone with the right bloodline factor, the right D error in their name, and the right fruit can literally talk to the world's infrastructure. Poneglyphs, sea kings, maybe even Uranas. You don't rule people, you administrate the planet. Model 3 is where it gets fun and slightly insane. Joy Boy as an emergent phenomenon. The old world's global system, those ancient energy networks, those weapon protocols, detect that reality is drifting toward permanent oppression and spawns a human avatar to auto-correct. Joy Boy isn't just using the system, he's the system trying to fix itself. Which raises the question, what happens if the patch gets bricked halfway? I want to emphasize how perfectly the failed update metaphor fits the void century. Noah's built. Poseidon exists. The Sea Kings are briefed. The Kozuki are carving poneglyphs as backup files to bypass censorship. Then the Red Line prison world is finalized, the world government forms, and the process hard crashes. Joy Boy's promise gets rolled back, but the installer is still lurking in the code. And the next time it boots up, we get someone even the celestial dragons are terrified of, a rubber idiot laughing his way toward the reset button. The question is, what exactly was that reset supposed to do to the map we're standing on right now? The ancient kingdom's culture, festivals, freedom, and dangerous fun. So here's the wild part. That reset button was probably less nuke the world and more throw the biggest block party the planet's ever seen. The ancient kingdom doesn't just look like a super science empire. It looks like a civilization that hard-coded fun into its operating system. Look at where we actually see old-world fingerprints. Shandora in Skypia, Golden Bell, giant poneglyph, and an entire city that literally weaponized music and dancing as a beacon to the world. Jaya's land of gold reputation? It's framed through pirate stories, tall tales, bar fights, and songs. Even Laugh Tale's name is just Oda walking on stage with a sign that says, "The final island is a punchline, not a throne." Advanced tech keeps showing up next to drums, banquets, and communal celebration, like the Wi-Fi password for this lost super network was, "Bring a guitar." Now contrast that with the world government's vibe, because as far as aesthetics go, this is a hard genre shift. Marie-Joie is sterile marble, empty plazas, and slave treadmills hidden out of frame. The celestial dragons float in glass bubbles like they're allergic to air, let alone street festivals. History is banned, laughter is policed, and anything that looks like too much freedom gets labeled piracy, terrorism, or, oh no, they're dancing in the streets again, call CP0. It's not just a political system, it's an anti-party policy. Here's an interesting thing. If you treat the ancient kingdom like a software engineer, festivals start looking less like fluff and more like infrastructure. Big shared meals, music, and stories are how you sync wildly different people. Giants, fishmen, minks, Shandians, Lunarians, whoever. If everyone knows the same songs and myths, you've built a cooperative global network without needing a single wanted poster. Play becomes protocol. Laughter is the handshake. The party is literally the update that keeps the system from fragmenting into 20 warring nations. And to be fair, From the perspective of 20 paranoid kings trying to hold on to power, that is horrifying. A culture where the default is sit down, eat, and listen to the same story is one where hierarchy dissolves fast. You can't maintain a rigid caste system when a festival keeps putting nobles, giants, and mermaids at the same table. So, you either adopt that OS or you wipe it. They chose wipe. I want to emphasize how much of that OS is still running in Luffy's era. Pirate crews throw parties after every arc, like it's a patch cycle. The D-bearers? They laugh at executions, at war, at the idea that fear is the only rational response. True power, over and over, comes from chosen family and shared meals. Bharati, Arlong Park, Water 7, Wano. The world government keeps trying to rule with fear and hierarchy, and the story keeps responding with, to which I say, have you tried friendship and meat? Which raises a nasty question. If this party-based operating system is the real surviving weapon of the ancient kingdom, where is it most intact right now? The answer might be one island we've barely seen, where festivals, strength, and old stories still rule. Elbaf, poneglyphs, the old world's encrypted patch notes. If Elbaf is the last big festival server still running, Joy Boy OS, then the poneglyphs are not storybooks. The Rio poneglyph is literally the README.MD for the planet. People keep calling them history stones, to which I say, that's like calling the Windows registry a diary. Technically true, spiritually very wrong. So, quick recap of the visible part of this iceberg. We know these are indestructible stone blocks carved by the Kozuki clan of Wano during the Void Century, written in a language the world government pretends is just too old to matter. Some record straight history. Some mark the locations or activation conditions of ancient weapons like Pluton and Poseidon, and all of them allegedly chained together into the Rio poneglyph, the full truth of the old world. And to be fair, that already sounds insane. A persecuted artisan family decides, during a world war, to build a global network of unbreakable lore rocks. But here's an interesting thing. The effort-to-payoff ratio is completely skewed if these are just narrative records. If you only wanted to smuggle a sad backstory into the future, you don't invent indestructible stone and distribute it under the ocean, in Sky Islands, and in Yonko territory. You do that when the content is so critical to the system that it needs to survive every purge cycle. We're not talking once upon a time. We're talking manuals for rebooting or reconfiguring the world itself. Look at the categories. History poneglyphs document the Void Century and the ancient kingdom's fall. Weapon poneglyphs contain what are basically APIN points for Pluton, Poseidon, and probably Uranus. Where to find them, how to call them, what not to do, unless you want a sea reset. Then you have oddballs, like Fishman Island's stone, tying Joy Boy's failed promise directly to the destruction of the Red Line and unification of the seas. That's not trivia. That's a commented function explaining how to undo the current map. And these aren't isolated. Different stones literally point to each other. Alabasta's poneglyph doesn't just sit there. It routes you toward Pluton. Skypia's redirects you further down the chain. O'Haran scholars had mapped at least 30 nodes before the Buster Call pulled the plug, because as far as design goes, this is a distributed documentation network. Each module covers one slice of the Old World OS, geography, weapons, social protocols like the Fishman Promise, and then cross-links to related modules. It's JavaDoc, but if reading JavaDoc was a capital crime. Which brings us to Robin. Her entire role is basically that of a systems engineer reading legacy code comments from a deleted GitHub repo. Everyone else sees fancy rocks. She sees stacked traces from a crashed civilization. And the world government's ban on poneglyph research? That's not just censorship. That's them outlawing the user manual for the operating system they hijacked. Do not read the part where we hard-forked reality. Too late. She already cloned the repo. I want to emphasize how wild that is. The most wanted scholar in the world is just someone trying to read the documentation, which makes you wonder, if the docs survived, did any of the original system architects survive too? And where would they be hiding? Wano, Shandora, and Alabasta, surviving shards of the Old World network. If the architects survived, they didn't just go into hiding. They containerized themselves into entire countries. The Old World didn't leave us one big ruin. It left a bunch of weirdly over-specialized micronations that feel like legacy servers nobody knows how to turn off. Wano is the most blatant example. It's not just Japan, but feudal. It's a country literally walled off from the sea by a vertical waterfall, ringed by mountain plates, like someone rage quit and slammed a tectonic firewall around it. People say, "Oh, that's just Oda being quirky with geography," to which I say, why does the one place that for sure manufactures poneglyphs also happen to be the least accessible node on the map? Because as far as narrative red flags go, that's a siren. The Kozuki clan invented the poneglyphs specifically to bypass world government censorship. That means Wano was the encryption and key management hub of the Old World. They don't just store data, they decide how it's encoded, who can read it, and how hard it is to brute force. Odin's log, the stone in Wano with the road glyph, the way their craftsmen casually carve nigh indestructible text like it's a family hobby. All of that screams root access. And to be fair, Wano's isolation looks less like traditionalism and more like a physical air gap. No Marines, no reverie, no updates. Then we have Shandora, the city of gold, that literally got yeeted into the sky and still tried to keep broadcasting. Here's an interesting thing. Its central artifact is a giant bell that does 3 jobs at once. It rings sound through the sky. It's made of gold that reflects light like a beacon, and on its surface is a poneglyph inscription pointing toward the ancient weapon Poseidon. That's not a random decoration, that's a multi-layered signal tower. Skypiea frames Shandora as a sacrifice, a city that fought for the light of Shandora and lost, but its bell survives as the last ping in a dead network. When Luffy rings it for cricket, he's unknowingly rebooting that old world broadcast, connecting the sky, the blue sea, and the void century in one very loud, very illegal notification. Shandora is the broadcast module. Take Wano's encrypted blocks, blast them across domains. Alabasta, meanwhile, is the weapons repository pretending very hard to be a normal desert kingdom. The Nefertari line knows something. They were supposed to be celestial dragons and opted out, stayed on the surface, and just coincidentally ended up custodians of Pluton's location. Not Pluton itself, but the pointer, which is actually scarier, because as far as control goes, address space is power. Cobra's secret meeting with the Gorosei, the way the royal tombs hide poneglyphs, Vivi's whole, trusted by the world, but not quite in the club, vibe. It all reads like a family that joined the new system, while quietly keeping the old world's nukes in cold storage. They're the armory node that signed the world government EULA, and then never deleted the dangerous files. Put together, these 3 are not just cool arcs, They're preserved modules of a distributed civilization. Wano encrypts and issues the blocks. Shandora broadcasts the message across layers of the world. Alabasta safeguards the weaponized side of that data. And the Straw Hats? They're accidentally running around reconnecting all three, like a pirate DevOps team rebooting a forbidden cluster. So what actually happens when Wano's keys, Shandora's bell, and Alabasta's blueprints finally sync again, and that old world network comes back online? The answer might literally reshape the seas. The Grand Line as a sandbox, controlled chaos to contain old world relics. So if Wano, Shandora, and Alabasta are quietly rebooting the old world network, we need to talk about the world's worst IT solution, the Grand Line. Because the Grand Line is not a pirate's graveyard. It's the world government's junk drawer. It's where you shove every dangerous thing you can't delete, slam it shut, and pray nobody digs through the cables. On paper, the Grand Line is just the crazy ocean. Unpredictable weather that flips from blizzard to desert in 5 minutes. Sea currents that ignore basic physics. Magnetic fields so scuffed that normal compasses literally have a mental breakdown, forcing you to use log poses that lock onto specific islands, like their Wi-Fi networks. And to be fair, that's already a fun idea. But here's an interesting thing. Almost every plot-relevant island, race, and relic just happens to be sitting along this one band. O'Hara's research, Alabasta's blueprints, Skypia's bell, Fishman Island's promise, Wano's poneglyph factory settings. Somehow, all the old world DLC is installed on this one server. People will say, "Yeah, that's just narrative convenience," to which I say, "Mate, your narrative convenience." Because as far as geography goes, this stops feeling like a natural ocean and starts feeling like a quarantine strip. You don't get that density of weapons, bloodlines, and taboo history by accident. You get it when someone 800 years ago looked at the ruins of a supercontinent, panicked, and said, "Okay, new map. All the cursed stuff goes in this lane, and we build a wall around it." Enter the Calm Belts and the Sea Kings. The Calm Belts are supposedly calm, but they're actually the most hostile borders on the planet. No wind, no currents, just massive Sea Kings treating your ship like a snack. That's not a random hazard. That's a living firewall. Normal ships can't cross in or out without special tech like Seastone hulls or Vegapunk's nonsense. Regular people are physically discouraged from even attempting to move between the safe blue oceans and the sandbox of chaos. I want to emphasize how elegant this is as a control system. You don't need to police every island if the ocean itself is doing the HR work. Dangerous races. Push them toward Grand Line Islands, ancient energy experiments. Those go in the belt. Void century scholars. Somehow, they all end up researching poneglyphs on or near that strip and then, mysteriously, get Buster called. And the world government? They tolerate it. They let warlords, Yonko, and revolutionaries treat the Grand Line like a battle royale lobby because that chaos is a pressure valve. As long as everyone's busy farming bounties and territory, nobody has time to connect all the old world dots, which is exactly what the Straw Hats are doing. Island by island, log pose hop by log pose hop. So what happens when someone doesn't just survive the sandbox but completes it, when a crew actually escapes the quarantine with the full old world picture? For that, we need to look at the map beneath the map, the red line itself. The 4 blues, manufactured provinces for a post-OS world. So we zoom out from the red line, this gigantic cosmic firewall, and what do we find on either side? 4 little user accounts with parental controls on East, West, North, and South Blue. The peaceful seas, the normal world. To which I say, that's not a world, that's a tutorial zone someone forgot to turn off. Because as far as vibes go, the contrast is insane. The Grand Line is this dense, overheating server of powers, weapons, poneglyphs, and random old-world artifacts just lying around in caves and sky islands. Meanwhile, the Blues are stuck on Windows 95. Cannons, basic Marine HQs, the occasional devil fruit that feels like it's spawned there by accident. You cross Reverse Mountain, and suddenly the tech tree and power ceiling jump like you accidentally paid for the premium version of reality. Here's an interesting thing. The Blues are peaceful, but not because humans there are better. They're peaceful because the system is throttled. Limited access to poneglyphs, almost no ancient weapons adjacency. D-bearers are rare, scattered, and usually socially buried. In the Blues, the world government can run its preferred narrative with minimal glitches. Pirates are mostly petty criminals. The Void Century is a myth. The Marines are heroes. And the idea of a previous global OS is just drunk old man bar talk. And to be fair, East Blue sells this really well. It's literally called the weakest sea. Luffy grows up in a backwater village. Zoro's doing crunches in a yard. Nami's robbing idiots for a fishman warlord. Very low stakes. Except then you realize this weakest sea quietly produced Luffy, Zoro, Nami, Usopp, Roger, Dragon, Garp, and freaking Shanks just casually docking there. Weakest sea, or heavily domesticated talent farm where you keep the future world shakers far away from poneglyphs and ancient energy until you can control them or kill them? North Blue is the mask slipping. On the surface, another quaint province. Underneath, it's Germa 66's mobile fascist science lab, Doflamingo's childhood playground, and whatever horror show produced X Drake. This is where we see that the Blues aren't innocent, they're curated. Genocide kingdoms, underworld pipelines, bloodline experiments with lineage factors, it's all there, just compartmentalized, so the average North Blue citizen can still believe they live in a normal world. Movement between blues is the key. It's heavily regulated, stupidly dangerous, or both. You either brave Reverse Mountain, beg the government for a legal route, or hitch a ride on some shady underworld ship. That's not a natural geography problem, that's a partition protocol. In the old world, these seas probably weren't culturally or politically segregated. You had one continuous human network, one shared information space. Then the great kingdom falls, the red line goes up, and suddenly the 4 blues are separate shards of human potential that can't easily recombine into another global OS. I want to emphasize Sanji's all-blue dream is literally about undoing this partition. One ocean, all fish, all cultures, all data in one place again. We're going to dig into that later because all blue isn't just a chef fantasy. It's the memory of a pre-partition world trying to boot back up. Fishman Island and Noah, the stalled migration protocol. And if all blue is the dream of the rebooted ocean, then Fishman Island is the sad little loading screen that never finished. It isn't just geographically stuck under the red line, it's narratively stuck in a paused cutscene from the Void Century. Because as far as the story is concerned, Fishman Island is literally living in a patch that was never pushed live. They're trapped 10,000 meters down, inside a fragile bubble that can pop if a Yonko sneezes too hard. Their entire culture is obsessed with the surface they were promised but never reached. Otohimi's petitions, The signatures, the sun pirate's scars, Shirahoshi staring at the sky she's never seen. It's like someone installed Go to the Surface 1.0 and then bricked the console. Here's an interesting thing. The island only exists in this form because the red line exists. No red line. No need to cram an entire race into a glorified aquarium. That's our first big old world tell. The geography is the prison, not the people. Enter Noah, the world's most suspiciously specific boat. It's a colossal ark, explicitly meant to be moved by sea kings, directly tied to Joy Boy's broken promise and Poseidon's power. The story keeps hammering that it is not yet time to use it. Not, we don't know what this does, but put this back in storage until the patch notes drop. People like to say Noah is just a symbol of Joy Boy's apology, to which I say, sure, and my external hard drive is just a symbol of my commitment to backups. The thing is engineered. It has a user, a transport method, and a scheduled activation window. That's not a metaphor. That's a migration protocol. I want to emphasize how weird it is that the poneglyph on Fishman Island directly talks about the eventual destruction of the Red Line and the unification of the seas. Joy Boy's promise wasn't, I'll make you feel better about racism. It was, we will physically move you when the map changes. Noah is the old world's U-Haul for fishmen, merfolk, and probably any other aquatic update the system needed to push. And, to be fair, the protocol almost runs by accident during Hodi's coup. Shirahoshi subconsciously commands the Sea Kings, Noah moves, and the whole thing feels like a half-triggered script in a game engine. Wrong time, wrong flag, same underlying code. Once you plug this into the ancient weapons, the picture gets ugly fast. Poseidon moves the living oceans. Pluton is a land-destroying warship tied to the world's end. Uranus is vaguely sky-coded and terrifying. Put them together, and you don't just have superweapons. You have a full reboot kit. Change the map, flood, or shatter the red line, then redistribute populations with arcs like Noah, so all blue can actually exist. So if Fishman Island is the most obvious victim of this stalled update, who else was supposed to move when the old world hit apply changes? The D as a political crime, why a letter terrifies gods. So if the old world was trying to hit apply changes on reality, the will of D is basically the error message that refused to uninstall. People treat it like a cute mystical middle initial, to which I say, that's like calling revolutionary just a fun job title on Dragon's LinkedIn. Here's an interesting thing. Oda goes out of his way to make the D feel systemic, but never administrative. We get storms at births, gods being natural enemies, Roger and Luffy laughing at the most inappropriate times imaginable. It's all vibes, no paperwork. But because as far as world-building goes, this series secretly loves paperwork, bounties, reveries, SSG budgets, it actually makes more sense if D started as a formal category in the old world. Not a random clan mark, but a box you ticked. Citizenship class of the ancient kingdom. Member of a revolutionary party. Signatory to some massive anti-God treaty. Imagine the ancient kingdom running on a literal legal identity that said, you are not subject to divine right. That would instantly explain why D-carriers keep doing the same three things. First, they laugh at death. If your founding document says gods and kings are just tall guys with good PR, then martyrdom isn't tragic, it's on brand. Second, they defy heavenly status. Luffy punching a celestial dragon, Law trying to assassinate Doflamingo, Blackbeard gunning for the throne of the world. These aren't quirks, they're people acting out a codified philosophy that rejects hereditary divinity as a valid power system. Third, they attract allies like magnets, because the original D contract probably promised shared dignity instead of top-down grace. And to be fair, the world government reacts to Ds like someone who still remembers exactly what that contract said. Look at Ace's execution. Public, spectacular, logistically insane. This is not how you handle just another pirate. It's how you legally demonstrate that this category of person is still outlawed. Sengoku doesn't say, he's dangerous because of his fruit. He says, he carries the blood of the demon. That's a statute being quoted, not a metaphor. Law and Rocinante literally talk about the D as something that brings storms and terrifies the celestial dragons, but nobody can explain why. That's what a broken legal memory looks like. The punishment survived, the definition didn't. Same with O'Hara. They weren't Ds, but they were reconstructing the old world's terms and conditions via poneglyphs, and the government responded with a buster call so overkill it makes Eni's lobby look like a parking ticket. I want to emphasize how weird the censorship pattern is. They erase the ancient kingdom's name so hard that even the poneglyphs dodge it, but they leave this one letter floating around in high-profile bloodlines. That's not clean erasure, that's a rushed redaction job on a collapsing timeline. You nuke the proper noun, you miss the legal shorthand. So when we start mapping D bloodlines onto old world power blocks later, buccaneer remnants, allied royal families, outlaw scholars, we're not just doing genealogy, we're reconstructing which factions signed that original anti-God contract and which ones quietly sold it out. Lineage factors, the ancient kingdom's forbidden operating system. And that anti-God contract wasn't just ideological, it was literally installable. The ancient kingdom didn't just have advanced tech, it had an operating system for living things, and the world government has been patching, pirating, and bricking that OS for 800 years. So, lineage factors. In canon, we get the sanitized brochure version, Judge talking about the blueprints of life, Vegapunk casually dropping that you can copy, edit, and paste abilities, and Mads treating human cloning like a mildly unethical group project. Fans act like this is some wild cutting-edge breakthrough, to which I say, mate, you're a rushed system, because as far as the Void Century is concerned, Judge and Vegapunk are just the kids who found an old laptop in the attic and think they invented Excel. Vegapunk literally calls devil fruits possibilities of human evolution and admits he just approximated a Zoan fruit into an artificial model. That's not discovery, that's reverse engineering. I want to emphasize, if one old man with a bad haircut and a tight budget can kind of fake a dragon fruit, what were people doing when this biotech was standard, regulated infrastructure? Here's an interesting thing. The moment you treat lineage factors as modular code, a bunch of mystery races stop being mystical and start looking like DLC packs. Lunarians with fire, flight, and busted durability. Three-eyed tribe with latent awakening powers. Fishmen and merfolk as aquatic environment builds. Giants as a size slider cranked to maximum. These don't read like random mutations, they feel like intentionally engineered profiles in the ancient kingdom's design suite. You need soldiers for sky warfare. Install Lunarian traits. You need red line maintenance crews before it became a permanent prison wall. Hybrid giants with specific resistances. And to be fair, One Piece already hints at this. The extinct Lunarians, the hunted buccaneers, the way Fishman Island is chained to a poneglyph about the sea's future, all of that looks like someone systematically uninstalling certain modules from the global user base. Now, plug devil fruits into this. Vegapunk describes them as the crystallized desires of people, but that actually sounds like a compiled ability package. Skills, environment assumptions, even personality quirks bundled into an inheritable data format. Eat the flame fruit, and you're not just getting fire powers. You're downloading an entire combat philosophy optimized around intangibility and area denial. Zoans overwrite your instincts. Mythical Zoans like Nika come with ideology preloaded. Freedom, joy, rubber nonsense, as if Joy Boy's OS shipped with a built-in UI theme for rebellion. Suddenly, the world government's weird fixation on bloodlines stops being just classism and becomes DRM. They ban research into lineage factors. They keep Tenryubito blood pure. They build Seraphim as controllable licensed clones. That's not science policy. That's an attempt to monopolize the old world's operating system while pretending it never existed. And if the OS is still running, in D-carriers, in poneglyph instructions, in fruits waiting to be installed, then the actual question isn't who inherits the world, it's who gets root access next. Devil fruits as old world software, installing powers on human hardware. So if lineage factors are the old world's root permissions, devil fruits are the cursed apps we keep sideloading onto human hardware and then acting shocked when the OS bricks itself. People love to quote Vegapunk's line that fruits are the desires of humans for how they could be made real, to which I say, cool TED Talk, but who exactly is running that wish fulfillment factory? Because as far as industrialized miracles go, that sounds less like random magic and more like ancient kingdom R&D. Somebody had to sit down and say, what if we could package turn into lightning as a stable, reproducible ability? That's a design document. That's a prototype. Over generations, those dreams stop being vague and start looking like product lines. Paramecia for physics hacks, Zoans for biological overlays, Logius for elemental admin access. Vegapunk is basically reverse engineering an 800-year-old software catalog and pretending it's philosophy. Here's an interesting thing. His own explanation secretly admits it's a system. If fruits are dreams made real, why are they so standardized? Why does every Gomu reboot into the same rubber profile? Every Mera reinstall the same fire toolkit? That's not chaotic magic. That's version control. Somebody locked these powers into templates and pushed them to production. And when you eat one, it doesn't just sit on top of your biology. It overwrites your lineage factor like a patch. Your body reboots with new default settings. You float, you stretch. You're sand now. Congratulations. The infamous sea weakness. That's a system-level conflict with the planet's underlying code. The same way an unauthorized kernel mod freaks out when it hits protected memory. The world itself, tied to whatever Mother Sea concept Imu is hoarding, recognizes devil fruit users as foreign processes and throttles them. Yami cranking that weakness up to 11 feels less like edgy darkness and more like a debug tool that force flags every devil fruit as corrupted. Zoans make this even louder. Regular Zoans are clean animal modules. Mythical Zoans are full expansion packs. Phoenix Regan, Sun God Flame, Nine-tailed Fox illusions, ancient Zoans, legacy drivers for extinct hardware like dinosaurs and mammoths. And to be fair, when you look at smiles, you can see how far modern science has fallen. Caesar's abominations are like pirated, half-translated shareware compared to the old world's pristine binaries, permanent side effects, cursed laughter, lion faces on your butt. This is what happens when you copy a system without the original documentation. I want to emphasize, this doesn't feel accidental. If the ancient kingdom knew the world government was going to nuke their hardware, their islands, their labs, their bloodlines, what do? You push a distributed backup. You encode your tech, your ideals, your "this is what humans could be" philosophy into portable software objects and scatter them across the seas. Every fruit eaten is another node booting up old-world code inside a modern body. And if that's true, then the Great Pirate Era isn't just about treasure. It's about reactivating a network. The next question isn't what power will Luffy awaken, it's what happens when enough of these programs start syncing again? The D bloodlines, mapping old-world factions onto modern families. If devil fruits are old-world apps quietly reinstalling themselves, then the D people are the original user accounts that the world government forgot to delete. And to be fair, you can kind of see the devs panicking, because as far as narrative red flags go, an entire letter that keeps showing up on wanted posters is basically a giant "Void Century was here" graffiti tag. So let's actually sort this supposed chaos. The Ds aren't one monolithic secret tribe. They rid like different departments of the same ancient kingdom coalition. The goal line, with Roger and now Luffy, are the pure explorers. Their whole deal is movement. Laugh-tail, rafting the world, casually walking into execution like it's a sightseeing tour. That's old-world expansion and contact energy, the people who went out to interface with other races and seas. Then we've got the monkey branch, which is exploration plus open warfare. Garp, Dragon, Luffy. These are not subtle people. They punch gods, declare war on the world government on live TV, and adopt orphans like it's a side quest. This feels like the ancient kingdom's frontline defenders, the ones who took the explorer ideal and said, "Cool, what if we suplexed a continent with it?" Trafalgar's line is different. Law is a surgeon, a planner, a saboteur. His power literally lets him rearrange the battlefield like a 4D puzzle. That screams old-world black ops, internal security, surgical strikes, the people you send to quietly delete a weapon or a king. Portgas, with Ace, looks like the shock trooper variant of that same role, a living warhead pointed at Whitebeard's enemies and his own fate. And then Jaguar D. Saul is our scholar archetype, tied straight into O'Hara and the poneglyph mystery. Here's an interesting thing. The one D we see directly connected to the lost language is also the one who says Robin will find true friends. That is exactly what a fallen knowledge faction would tell the next generation of librarians. Around them, the non-D but suspiciously aligned families feel like regional branches of this old-world network. The Kozuki literally built the poneglyph system as anti-censorship tech. The Fishman royal line is sitting on a poneglyph, an ancient weapon, and a promise from Joy Boy about destroying the Red Line and unifying the seas. Giants keep turning up as guardians of key sites. These aren't random. They're like shard states of the original alliance. And then the Nefertari, the one royal family that refused to move to Maria Joie. The world government goes, "Come be gods," and they go, "Actually, we're good. We'll stay in the desert with our giant underground tomb full of secrets." People treat that as flavor, to which I say, "Mate, that's a smoking gun." That's a family that consciously chose the losing side, then hid in plain sight as loyal kings while quietly passing down Void Century crumbs. I want to emphasize how much this all feels like a map trying to redraw itself. As the story moves, These bloodlines keep drifting toward each other. Luffy with Law, Robin with the Giants and the Kozuki, Vivi with the Straw Hats, Shirahoshi awakening as Poseidon. What happens when all of them, plus whatever's left of the monkey, Gol, Portgas, Jaguar, and Nefertari threads, stand on the same side again? We don't just get a pirate alliance, we get the ancient kingdoms coalition booting back up. And if that old world network really does reassemble, the next question isn't, can they beat Amu? It's, what buried protocol inside those bloodlines activates when the alliance is finally complete? The Void Century, as a slow-motion coup, rebuilding the timeline. So if those buried protocols are waiting to boot back up, we kind of need to know what software was running the first time. Because as far as the Void Century goes, the fandom treats it like one giant nuke. Boom! Ancient kingdom gone, world government up. To which I say, that's not a war, that's a cutscene. Oda's been quietly feeding us something messier, more like a slow-motion coup stretched over 100 years. Here's an interesting thing. If we divide that century into early destabilization, open conflict, and post-war consolidation, suddenly the clues stop fighting each other. Early phase first. The ancient kingdom is on top. Advanced tech, weird energy, culturally dominant enough that you get Joy Boy promising entire ocean migrations. They don't just have power. They are the default operating system of the world. So how do 20 scared smaller kingdoms fight that without immediately getting vaporized by whatever pre-Pluton nightmare engines the old world had? You don't start with bombs, you start with stories. Information war, propaganda, trade blockades, religious framing, the sun god, and devils of the sea. Stuff we see echoing in Skypiea, in Fishman discrimination, in the way D is treated like a curse. That reads like centuries of narrative work. Turn the ancient kingdom's tech and freedom cult into devil fruits, literally branded as sinful. Turn their allies, fishmen, giants, weird bloodlines, into monsters. And to be fair, if the ancient kingdom is running around casually rewriting the weather, that is very easy to spin as heresy. Then we slide into open conflict. This is where the poneglyph timestamps and Fishman Island's prophecy kick in. The Kozuki start carving indestructible receipts while the war is actively going, which means the censorship machine is already online. At the same time, the map itself gets patched. Either the red line is constructed or some dormant Uranus-tier geo-weapon gets flipped from safety barrier to continental firewall. Pluton, a ship designed to erase islands, suddenly makes tactical sense in a world where your enemy can literally wall off oceans. The Grand Line stops being a quirky sea and becomes a kill box. Trade routes fracture. Old world allies get isolated. Poseidon's promise to bring fishmen to the surface is tied to the destruction of the Red Line, which implies that line is the mid-war patch that broke the original plan. Post-war consolidation is the quiet horror. The 20 kingdoms unite into the world government with a big peace treaty vibe. But that treaty is written on the corpse of the ancient kingdom. The Void Century gap isn't just missing pages, it's legal erasure. If it's not on the official timeline, it never had rights, never had treaties, never had land. And I want to emphasize, that's the genius villain move. You don't just win the war, you win the paperwork. So what happens when the paperwork finally gets contested again? 20 crowns, 1 throne. How the founding kingdoms carved up the old world. So when the paperwork finally gets contested, the first thing you notice is the signatures, 20 of them, 20 crowns, 1 throne, and an entire old world carved up like it was a Blackbeard family dinner. Because as far as we can tell, Those 20 kingdoms weren't random dots on a map. They were the regional bosses who survived the great kingdom's collapse. You've got obvious ones like the Don Quixote line, probably tied to some powerful North Blue province that specialized in trade and celestial manufacturing. Then the Nefertari of Alabasta, sitting on a desert hub that controlled ancient waterways, and, let's be honest, a suspicious amount of Pluton-adjacent archaeology. Dressrosa's Riku family feels like the inheritors of a southern cultural heartland, the kind of place the ancient kingdom might have used as a bridge between humans, dwarves, and toys before that whole turn them into slaves and novelties pivot. Here's an interesting thing. When you line up what we know of the royals, you can kind of reverse engineer their loot. The world nobles parade slaves from Fishman Island, the buccaneers, giants, long legs, long arms, you name it. That implies at least a couple founding kingdoms annexed whole non-human regions that used to be semi-autonomous under the ancient kingdom's umbrella. The Tenryubito's casual use of bubble tech and moving walkways? That screams repurposed ancient tech scaled down from something like the super-civilization's transport system. So why drag almost all of these royal families up to Maria-Joie? On paper, it's a promotion. In practice, it's centralized hostage-taking. You remove the kings from their conquered territories, park them on top of the Red Line, and suddenly every royal is both a shareholder and a prisoner. If one kingdom rebels, you don't just punish them. You punish their cousins at the next reverie. It's ideological daycare. Everyone breathes the same propaganda air, worships the same empty throne, and forgets what their people actually look like. And to be fair, it's smart. Physically separating rulers from the ruled is how you stop sympathy from growing. You can't see the famine in your protectorate if you live in a bubble suit. Except the Nefertari line says no. This is where people go, "Oh, they were just cowards who didn't want to move." To which I say, mate, they walked away from being literal gods. Cobra and Vivi's whole vibe retroactively reframes that choice. By staying in Alabasta, the Nefertari keep one foot in the old moral universe. They signed the winning side's treaty, yes, but they refuse the heavenly dragon cosplay. It's a partial moral refusal. Publicly, they're founders. Privately, they're the weak link in the system. I want to emphasize how messy that carve-up is long-term. You get oppressed races like the Fishmen, shoved under a promise Joy Boy failed to fulfill. You get islands stripped for resources to feed Maria-Joie excess, like some unseen version of what Walpole did on a smaller scale. You get kingdoms like Drum, Goa, even Dressrosa that remember, in this vague, angry way, that they used to be more autonomous before global peace arrived with a brand. And those structural fault lines? They're not ancient history. They're ticking right now. The only question is, who's actually willing to press on them hard enough to crack the throne? Poneglyphs as encrypted backups, the ancient kingdom's last failsafe. And if you're going to crack the throne, you kind of need to know what the original operating system even was. Because as far as the ancient kingdom is concerned, the world government didn't just uninstall it. They tried to wipe the hard drive, smash the disks, and arrest anyone who remembered what a computer was. That's where the poneglyphs walk in, looking like oversized paperweights and secretly being the most over-engineered backup architecture in shonen history. On the surface, we're told they're indestructible history stones. Cool, museum piece moving on, but look at the actual properties. They're literally unbreakable by anything we've seen. They're linguistically locked behind a dead script only a handful of people can read. and they're geographically scattered across every impossible corner of the map. That's not just lore flavor, that's RAID storage. You separate the data so no single flood, buster call, or ideology purge can kill it. You create a system where physical erasure and narrative erasure both fail. And to be fair, this is where the Kozuki clan suddenly stop being that one cool samurai family and start looking like the old world's lead dev team. They don't just carve fancy kanji. They were the only people trusted to encode the master files. Wano's isolation? Everyone treats it like quirky culture, to which I say that's a locked server room. Closed borders, no Den Mushi spam, no world government VPN. If you're designing a secure node to preserve and update the core records of a banned civilization, you basically build Wano. Here's an interesting thing. When you lay out the known poneglyph locations, they sketch an alliance route more than a scavenger hunt. Alabasta, a desert kingdom with deep, suspiciously old royal knowledge. Skypia, literally off the grid in the sky, protected by obscurity. Fishman Island, sitting on the only mandatory tunnel between the Blues and the New World, tying Joy Boy's promise directly to the future destruction of the Red Line. Zoo, a walking sovereign state that refuses to sit still on any map. Each one is a host kingdom that survived the purge just enough to guard one shard of the fail-safe. The O'Harans had identified at least 30 of these nodes before getting vaporized for their trouble. So, we're not talking about a couple of Easter eggs. We're talking about a distributed resistance network that outlived its own creators. And I want to emphasize, when we say Rio Poneglyph, we talk about it like it's a history PDF. But what if it's a manual? A set of instructions for how to reconfigure the seas, reboot ancient kingdom technology, maybe even flip whatever switch originally turned the world into this Grand Line prison? If the scattered stones are backup fragments, the Rio is the recovery wizard, which raises a terrifying little question. What actually happens when somebody finally hits restore? Uranus, weather control or planetary route access? What happens when somebody hits restore? The boring answer is nothing, because that's not how oceans work, to which I say, tell that to the guy who just deleted Lulucia like it was a file on the desktop. Let's talk Uranus, the weapon we know the least about, and, somehow, the one doing the loudest quiet flex in the story. Canonically, we have almost nothing. A name tied to the sky god, a vague association with the heavens, and that one scene where Imu looks at a map, circles Lulucia, and the island is just gone. Not blown up on panel, not Marineford but bigger, just erased under a weird, descending cloud halo. People go, oh, okay, space laser, and to be fair, One Piece has giant elephants, moon robots, and a skeleton musician, so sure add orbital death ray to the mess. But here's an interesting thing. Nothing about Lulusia looks like a beam. No light column, no giant cannon, no buster call on steroids. What we actually see is the sky itself being edited. Cloud density ramps up, lightning cages the area, the sea around it reacts, and then the island is missing, like the map texture failed to load. That's not just destruction, that's a settings change. So, what if Uranus isn't a gun at all? What if it's root access to the planet's environmental system? Because as far as sky powers go, One Piece already has a suspiciously coherent tech tree. Sky islands run on dials and mysterious island clouds that behave like programmable terrain. Weatheria literally bottles weather. The Calm Belt is a perfectly still ocean ring that just happens to lock the blues in place. These aren't random quirks. They look like different user interfaces for the same ancient energy grid. I want to emphasize, the series keeps hinting that the world is engineered. Fishman Island's poneglyph ties Joy Boy's promise to destroying the Red Line and uniting the seas. The Grand Line's weather is aggressively artificial. The calm belt is like a firewall. In that context, Uranus stops being Sky Nuke and becomes Admin Login. It can talk to whatever system is generating sea currents, cloud layers, maybe even localized gravity. Revisit Lulusia with that in mind. If Uranus can rewrite parameters, Emu doesn't need to drop a rock. They can tell the grid, in this coordinate range, remove landmass, raise sea level, crank cloud opacity, redirect light. To outside observers, the island is annihilated. On the back end, the map data was quietly patched. It's a targeted reality rewrite using climate and atmosphere as the UI. And if that's true, then the real horror isn't that Uranus can delete islands. It's that whoever holds it gets to decide whether the ocean stays a prison or gets rolled back closer to the old world's navigable seas. Do you keep the Grand Line as a chaotic moat? Or do you flatten the currents and tear down the calm belts? Do you maintain the world government's patch, or risk loading the original version of the world, bugs and all? Because what if Restore doesn't just fix the map? It wakes something up that's been sleeping under it. Ancient energy, the missing fuel that powered gods and islands. Because what if the thing that wakes up isn't a beast or a god, but the world's old operating system booting back on? One Piece kind of treats the planet like a dead laptop whose charger got snapped 800 years ago. The Void Century isn't just missing lore, it's a missing power cable. Here's an interesting thing. Every time Oda shows us advanced tech, he quietly pairs it with a failed energy story. Skypia's dials are literally consumer-grade miracle batteries, casually storing kinetic force, sound, heat, even memories. And the Sky People act like that's normal. Vegapunk spends his life chasing a clean, limitless power source, fails, and settles for weaponized sunlight lasers. Egghead is hyped as the future, but its entire system is this precarious, overclocked grid that he admits he can't scale. So when people say, "Wow, the ancient kingdom was so advanced," to which I say, they weren't just advanced. They'd already solved the energy problem everyone else is still LARPing around. Call it ancient energy. Not a devil fruit, not cola, not sea stone hamsters on wheels. A planetary-scale, clean, near-limitless power field that the old world tapped into, the way Skypiea taps into clouds. Vegapunk literally says he dreamed of an energy that could be shared by the whole world. That's not just a random line. That's a man reading the patch notes of a lost technology and trying to brute force it back. I want to emphasize how big this has to be, because as far as the series' vague science goes, the scale is insane. You don't power continent-busting weapons like Pluton, a weather-controlling sea god like Poseidon, and a possible sky nuke like Uranus with some coal and a smile. The most reasonable idea is that the planet itself was wired. Red line nodes acting as colossal pylons, seafloor conduits channeling energy along the old continental routes, atmospheric collectors in sky islands catching whatever weird radiation this world gives off, the globe as one giant circuit board. Destroy that grid, or intentionally shut it down during the Void Century, and everything faceplants. Islands that were once synced to the network become stranded rocks. Tech that assumed infinite baseline power suddenly looks like nonsense you can't reproduce. The ancient kingdom's miracles turn into forbidden weapons, partly because nobody has the charger anymore. And to be fair, that's exactly what we see. Modern science is a mess of half-measures, sea-stone hacks, and devil fruit workarounds, while the poneglyph era feels casually godlike. Which leads to the uncomfortable part. You can't actually change the world at endgame scale without fixing the power problem. You want to flatten the red line, merge the seas, feed every island, and give fishmen sunlight? You're not doing that on windmills and sea train boilers. Reactivating or replacing ancient energy is probably the hidden precondition for the final war. Because, as far as rebooting a planet goes, somebody has to flip the breaker back on. So, who gets to touch that switch first? Joy Boy's inheritors, or the people who killed the lights last time? Fishman Island and the Sunlight Debt, a promise from the old world. So when we ask who gets to flip the breaker, Fishman Island is basically standing in the dark waving both hands like, "Hi, remember the unpaid sunlight bill?" Because that's what Joy Boy's apology actually is. A receipt for a project the old world already started and then catastrophically failed to finish. Joy Boy's poneglyph down there is weirdly specific. It's not some vague, "sorry about the war." It's, "I promised you something concrete and I blew it." That something is sitting right above the island. Noah. A continent-class ship parked in a bubble under the red line, explicitly tied to Poseidon and designed to move an entire people. That's not a random ancient flex. That's infrastructure. That's the relocation phase of a social experiment that got interrupted by genocide. Here's an interesting thing. The promise isn't "we'll visit more" or "better trade routes." It's a day when fishmen live under the sun. To which I say, cool, where? Because as far as we can see, the current map literally does not have space for that. The surface is carved up by the red line, ring-fenced by the calm belts, and socially locked by a caste system where fishmen are at best exotic labor and, at worst, property. To move them up, you don't just need boats. You need a new planet layout and a new ideology. That's why the red line destruction theory isn't just fan cartography. The poneglyph itself links Joy Boy's failure to the eventual breaking of that wall and the unification of the seas. Physically, you give fishmen sunlight by making the ocean one continuous, navigable habitat instead of a four-sea prison. Socially, you kill the idea that surface equals superior by making the surface itself a shared, chaotic mess where everyone is equally lost and equally wet. And to be fair, the story keeps leaking fragments of that old-world pitch. Queen Otoheim's activism? She's literally running a one-woman PR campaign for the original contract. Coexistence, mutual citizenship, no more underworld races. The Sun Pirates burning their brand into their backs to cover slave marks. That's not just edgy tattoo discourse. That's them re-importing the Old Kingdom's solar logo as a jailbreak symbol. We are not your property. We're children of the same sky you keep for yourself. I want to emphasize how hard the world government overreacts to this. Otohime gets assassinated and framed. Tiger dies. Fisher Tiger's story is scrubbed. Even the word sun becomes suspicious branding if you're a non-human. It's the same pattern as O'Hara. Any attempt to revive a multiracial post-caste society gets nuked from orbit because it rhymes too much with whatever the ancient kingdom was selling. And that circles us back to the uncomfortable part. To finally pay off Joy Boy's debt, you probably have to use the exact tools that broke the world. Pluton to rewrite geography, Poseidon to move Noah and the seas themselves, and Uranus to do whatever terrifying sky-level edit it does, Are we about to watch Luffy's generation reboot the same dangerous power system that got the first Joy Boy killed? Or is there a third option we're not seeing yet? Giants, Elbaf, and the lost vanguard of the old war. And if the endgame is about rebooting a broken power system, then we kind of have to talk about the guys who were built to run that system on ultra-hard mode, the Giants of Elbaf. People like to treat Elbaf as, haha, Viking filler island but real this time, to which I say, you don't park an entire race of walking siege engines off-screen for 25 years, unless they're sitting on something dangerous. Because as far as culture goes, Elbaf is almost comically on brand for an old-world military state, warrior pride as religion, duels as conflict resolution, kids raised on tales of legendary captains like Dory and Brogy, who literally spend a century head-butting dinosaurs and calling it cardio. And underneath all that goofy honor code stuff is the real weapon, longevity. A human historian gets, 70 years? A giant can personally remember 2 or 3 generations of human governments lying to them. Here's an interesting thing. That combination of absurd physical power and absurd lifespan is exactly what you'd want if you were the ancient kingdom designing shock troops and living archives. You don't just need soldiers. You need eyewitnesses who can say, no, I was actually there when the seas were different, 800 years later. That's not a metaphorical inherited will. That's your grandpa who watched the map get patched. And, to be fair, Oda doesn't scream this at us. He just quietly drops Jaguar D. Saul, a giant with the D initial, into Ohara. This is insane. The Ds are already framed as the old world's problem children, the people whose very names survived the world government's rewrite. Slap that onto a giant vice admiral who defects to protect archaeologists, and you've basically drawn a line from the ancient kingdom's infantry to the last major attempt to decode the poneglyph system. I want to emphasize how weird Saul really is. A marine giant, branded a traitor, who then survives a buster call and ends up on Elbaf preserving Ohara's books. That's not just a fun twist. That's a giant faction literally carrying the will of the old world into the age of Robin. At minimum, it tells us some giants sided with the ancient kingdom during the Void Century and never fully came back inside the world government's narrative. So why is Elbaf so isolated? Pride is the in-universe answer, but that reads like the cover story you tell nosy neighbors. After the Void Century, if you're a race that fought for the losing side and you remember the original world map, you go into strategic retreat. You lock your island down, you keep your history oral, your artifacts buried, and you politely do not write anything the Gorosei can burn, which is exactly why Elbaf showing up in the story's final act is terrifying for the status quo. Imagine a whole nation of people who can say, no, the world government's founding story is wrong, and our grandmothers saw what really happened to that single forgotten kingdom you keep pretending doesn't exist. What happens when those memories line up with the poneglyphs, with Ohara's rescued research, with whatever the Straw Hats dig up about the man-made prison that is the current world map? The moment Elbaf stops being neutral, the official history doesn't just crack. It gets drop-kicked like a toy ship in Big Mom's flashback. And if the giants were the old war's vanguard on land, what does that say about the races who dominated the skies and the deep sea? Wano, Pluton, and the locked gate to the old world. If Elbaf was the old war's battering ram, then Wano is the locked safe in the back room that everyone politely pretends not to see. The series treats it like a quirky samurai theme park, to which I say, That's a very elaborate cosplay for a country literally sitting on top of a doomsday engine. Because as far as geography goes, Wano is a mess in the most suspicious way possible. It's a country perched on a plateau, ringed by waterfalls that run the wrong way, with sea levels that don't match the outside world. People look at that and go, "Wow, fantasy Japan," and Oda quietly sips his ancient energy. This is not just isolationist policy. This is a natural vault that's been artificially cranked up. You don't get reverse waterfalls and a self-contained weather system without someone in the old world poking the planet's settings. Here's an interesting thing. We already know from Alabasta that Pluton is somewhere in Wano. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, just parked. So, take that elevated bowl of land, add an insane pressure barrier of water and clouds, and suddenly Wano looks less like a country and more like a lid. The ancient kingdom needed to hide one of its main geoengineering tools, so it turned an entire region into a planetary lock, then left a very specific family in charge of the keys. That's where the Kozuki come in. The story frames them as noble artisans who can carve poneglyphs, and to be fair, that alone is wild. They're literally the only confirmed group who can work that material. But if you can engrave indestructible data blocks, you're not just a historian, you're IT support for the apocalypse. The Kozuki weren't only archivists, they were key holders. One set of instructions is scattered across the world as poneglyphs, the other is hardwired into Wano's infrastructure. Floodgates, seawalls, whatever ancient switch actually wakes Pluton up. Odin's obsession with opening the borders suddenly stops being just guy who read too many travel brochures. He reads Roger's logbook, sees the void century truth, and instantly reframes Wano as a locked control room that's supposed to go online in a specific era. Then Toki drops her prophecy about 800 years in the future like it's casual small talk. She is literally from the old world. She knows the timing. That's not romance. That's scheduled maintenance. So when we talk about opening Wano, people treat it like a political reform arc, to which I say, mate, that's a firmware update for the planet. Lower the walls, reconnect the currents, and suddenly Pluton isn't just a rumor, it's back on the network. The same system that once reshaped seas, maybe even helped build the Red Line prison map, is about to be re-exposed to every lunatic with a warship and a dream. I want to emphasize how terrifying that is because if Wano is one lock on the old world's tools, what exactly is waiting at the other locks we haven't recognized yet? Skypiea, Shandora, and the fallen satellites of the old world. So if Wano is one lock, Skypiea is what happens when a lock gets blown off and launched into the ceiling. People treat Sky Islands as goofy side content, to which I say, you saw a golden city yeeted 10,000 meters up and your takeaway was fun cloud level? Let's rewind. Skypiea's history is framed as this local dispute. Shandians versus Sky People, land versus cloud, 400 years of petty warfare over a bell and some dirt. But because as far as the old world is concerned, Shandora reads like a ground-level node of that same super network we've been talking about. It had a poneglyph, it had a massive gold bell that literally functions as a signal booster, and it sat in a strategic position on the ancient sea routes, right up until knock-up stream punted it into the troposphere. That's not just a tragedy. That's a satellite falling out of orbit and getting jammed into the wrong layer of the map. Here's an interesting thing. The Shandian poneglyph doesn't talk about local sky politics at all. It's quietly routing you to Poseidon, to Fishman Island, to the broader ancient kingdom plot. The city's role is infrastructural. It's a relay tower, which makes the Great Bell feel less like random bling and more like an old-world lighthouse, designed to sync with some wider energy system we still don't fully understand. Then you look at Sky Island tech, dials, cloud roads, milky dial motorboats, the way they casually store sound, heat, kinetic force like it's an IKEA starter pack for elemental powers. People call it quirky fantasy tech, and to be fair, it is, but it also looks like consumer-grade spin-off hardware. This is what happens when the central research culture is gone, and all you have left is whatever the old world left, plugged into the atmosphere. It's like everyone's driving around with Joy Boy's discarded USB sticks. No manual, just vibes. And then Enel shows up and accidentally cosplays as an old-world engineer. Arc Maxim is ridiculous, yes, but it's also the first time we see someone deliberately weaponize sky infrastructure to go orbital. He literally rides a lightning-powered golden blimp to the moon and finds an ancient city full of space robots and murals of winged people migrating to Earth. You're telling me the old world wasn't already playing with extraterrestrial or at least orbital platforms before the Void Century collapse? Because as far as visual storytelling goes, that's Oda screaming, this system used to be connected off-planet. Now, the Shandians' 400-year war with Skypiea suddenly looks like a tiny reenactment of the bigger conflict. A displaced old-world ground tribe ripped from its ecosystem, screaming about lost land and erased history, fighting sky dwellers who inherited tech they don't really understand. Sound familiar? It's basically the Void Century in miniature. Their eventual alliance, brokered by Luffy ringing the bell and literally reconnecting Shandora's signal to the Blue Sea, is our test case. This is what old tech integration looks like when it goes right. So the question is, if one fallen satellite and one confused island nation can figure it out, what happens when entire surface powers start turning old-world nodes back on at scale? Egghead as a ghost of the old world, Vegapunk's accidental reconstruction. And Egghead is the answer to that question that got out of hand. Because as far as the world government is concerned, Egghead isn't the island of the future. It's a haunted house. It's a ghost of the old world that accidentally respawned in the wrong patch of ocean with worse Wi-Fi and a bigger shark. Look at the feature set. Climate control so precise, it makes Punk Hazard look like a busted thermostat. Holograms dense enough to fake whole cityscapes. Food materialization that just prints cheeseburgers out of light and data. An energy system so abundant that Vegapunk treats power the way Luffy treats meat, as an infinite, slightly stupid constant. We're told this is 500 years ahead, to which I say, 500 years ahead of what? The only benchmark that makes sense is a civilization that already lived like this. Here's an interesting thing. Every one of those egghead miracles lines up with something we've glimpsed from the ancient kingdom. Weather manipulation? We have Uranus, the weapon that probably rewrote the sky, and maybe the entire map. Hologram-adjacent projections and solid light? Think of the way the poneglyphs are basically indestructible hard drives, or how the giant straw hat and Imu's room feel like the remains of a lost interface. Infinite energy? That mysterious, ancient energy source Vegapunk taps into, that the Mother Flame and the Egghead Dome both rely on, is almost certainly the same battery that powered warships big enough to fight gods. So Vegapunk's future looks suspiciously like a low-resolution screenshot of the Void Century's civilian lifestyle. He's not inventing a new system. He's speed-running archaeology with a lab coat. The man literally finds a giant robot from 900 years ago, can't replicate its power source, and instead builds an entire island trying to cosplay as the thing that made it move. And to be fair, that's kind of what any genius would do if they had fragments of Joy Boy's user manual and absolutely no respect for zoning laws. But the tech is only half of why Egghead feels like a ghost. Look at the social dynamics. Knowledge is shared across 6 satellites and a whole population of researchers. Status is flattened. Even Atlas can yell at Shaka, the logic brain. Robots and Seraphim handle most of the brute labor, which means humans are freed up to think, argue, and eat laser-microwaved noodles. That's suspiciously close to the anti-hierarchical, everyone laughs at the same table vibe we associate with the will of D. If the D clan is the ideological descendant of the ancient kingdom, Egghead is what happens when you give that ideology a campus. People collaborate instead of kneel. The island itself protects them. Authority is distributed into literal multiple bodies. Does that sound like any monarchy in one piece? Or does it sound like a world the 20 kings would absolutely nuke out of fear? I want to emphasize the Buster Call, Saturn's arrival, Kizaru's deployment. This isn't about one overworked scientist with a big head. It's about the proof of concept. Egghead shows that with enough fragments, enough memory, you can start rebuilding the old world from scratch. And if one man and a scrapyard can do that, what happens when that ghost of the old world starts syncing up with the other ghosts we've already met? Inherited will as system restore, how the old world keeps rebooting itself. So when people say inherited will is just anime destiny, to which I say, cool, so the most paranoid government in the world has been losing to vibes for 800 years. That's not a plot point. That's a failed IT department. What we're actually looking at is the old world's version of a system restore point, quietly reinstalling itself through people instead of hard drives. Because as far as we can tell, will in One Piece is a 3-layered mess. First layer, lineage factors. Vegapunk basically comes out and says your genes are a script, not just for your body, but for your tendencies. Buccaneer blood, Lunarian traits, the D initial popping up in wildly different families. That's not random. That's the ancient kingdom baking in predispositions toward certain ideas, curiosity, rebellion, and allergy to authoritarian nonsense. Second layer, culture. The Kozuki clan engraving poneglyphs, Fishman Island passing down Joy Boy's apology, Elbaf clinging to warrior honor, even tiny places like Fuchsia Village raising kids who think Pirate King sounds like a reasonable career path. These are basically OS patches, local scripts that keep re-downloading old world values even after each Buster Call wipes the cache. And then there's the weird third layer, devil fruits. Vegapunk calls them wishes of humanity. But here's an interesting thing. Those wishes line up suspiciously well with the ancient kingdom's rumored tech and ideals. Sun god Nika, Poseidon talking to sea kings, Robin's brain fruit, Law's surgery fruit, even the very idea of turning imagination into power. It feels like the old world encoded directives into reality itself. You don't just inherit will by blood. You can literally eat it. Once you see it like that, Joy Boy, Roger, Luffy, Odin, even Garp and Saul and Fujitora stop looking like isolated madmen and start looking like periodic update packets. Every era, the system pings the network, and someone boots up with the freedom plus open seas plus racial equality plus tell the truth bundle pre-installed. The world government keeps trying to uninstall it, and to be fair, they get pretty close. O'Hara, God Valley, God Valley 2, Marineford Edition. But the same dreams respawn somewhere else. I want to emphasize how weird that is. You have 800 years of censorship, propaganda, literal language control, and yet the exact same dream architecture keeps resurfacing. A world without walls, the seas united, sky people and fishmen and giants not being walking hate crimes, history being public instead of contraband. That's not coincidence, that's mimetic engineering that actually works. So Egghead shows us the hardware ghost of the old world, but inherited will is the software ghost. The next big question is what happens when those ghosts finally sync with the literal ancient weapons and the man-made prison seas. What does a reboot look like when your reset button is Uranus? Your network cables are the red line and your antivirus is a rubber man who refuses to update? Because when that system restore finally runs, is the world getting patched or completely wiped? Rebuilding the old world timeline from Great Kingdom Peak to global blackout. So let's actually hit pause on the cosmic antivirus bit and just rebuild the save file. Because as far as the void century goes, people act like it's this unknowable black hole, to which I say, it's the opposite problem. It's 100 years where Oda crammed in so many world-breaking patches that the changelog basically writes itself. Fast recap. Before the void century, we've got the Great Kingdom at peak power, a super civilization with ancient energy reactors, full lineage factor tinkering, and what are basically user-friendly devil fruit UIs, open sea culture, no prison map grand line, and an ideology that looks suspiciously like Joy Boy's every race at the same table dream. Then you have rising aristocratic blocks, proto-celestial dragons, who look at this whole freedom-as-a-service model and go, cool tech, terrible politics. So, timeline, clean version. Step 1. Great Kingdom hegemony. They dominate the seas, probably with a network of Poseidon-style sea kings, Pluton-class warships, and maybe even a proto-Uranus grid as planetary Wi-Fi. Travel is open. Fishman Island isn't a glorified waiting room, and the red line is either smaller, segmented, or straight-up artificial. Here's an interesting thing. Fishman Island's poneglyph literally ties Joy Boy's promise to destroying the red line later, which implies it was already a problem that needed uninstalling. Step 2. Ideological split. Authoritarian factions inside and outside the kingdom want hierarchy, clean bloodlines, and tight control over lineage factors. The D people become the face of the opposite idea. Inherited will over inherited status. Step 3. Arms race. Both sides scramble for ancient energy and super weapons. Uranus becomes the sky nuke or climate lever. Pluton is engineered as the ultimate deterrent ship, and Poseidon gets framed as either the kingdom's trump card or the thing that scares the future 20 kingdoms the most. Step 4. Coordinated crusade. 20 kingdoms unite. Call it a holy war to stabilize the world and target the great kingdom's tech hubs, races, and bloodlines. That's where you get persecuted Lunarians, buccaneers, and the early criminalization of anyone with that annoying D middle initial. Step 5. Cataclysmic war. Uranus or some red line weaponization scars the planet, sea levels spike, continents vanish, and the Grand Line prison route is either constructed or locked into place. Step 6. Post-war information purge. The victors found the world government, outlaw poneglyphs, and systematically compress an entire systemic reboot, 3 ancient weapons, a global map rewrite, genocide, and a fallen super-civilization into one vague void century label. I want to emphasize how funny that is in a dark way. It's not that the history is missing, it's over-compressed patch notes, And to be fair, that overcompression actually helps us. When you know the red line, Uranus, Poseidon, Pluton, and the D-purge all have to fit in the same short window, the order stops being a wild theory mess and starts looking like a forced puzzle. Next, we're going to weaponize that reconstructed timeline and ask, if the first world got soft reset once, what does the second reset look like when Joy Boy wins? Why, the world government still acts like it's losing a 900-year-old war. So if the first world got soft reset once, we have to ask, why does the current winner act like the patch never installed? The world government walks around like a guy who already beat the final boss, but still sleeps in full armor, sword under the pillow, buster call on speed dial. People will say, well, they're just authoritarian, that's what they do, to which I say, no normal state nukes its own judiciary island for optics. Amy's lobby isn't a rebel fortress, it's literally their courthouse. O'Hara isn't a military base, it's a library. God Valley was so bad they deleted the island from the map. These aren't law and order moves. These are wartime protocols being run in peacetime, 800 years later, on anything that smells like the ancient kingdom. You don't vaporize archaeologists unless, in your internal manual, archaeologist and enemy codebreaker are still the same job. Here's an interesting thing. Once you factor Emu in, the paranoia suddenly makes sense. The whole empty throne, the big symbolic no one rules the world chair, it's a lie that only works if the true sovereign never took off their war hat. Emu is literally the embodiment of a permanent state of emergency. No demobilization, no peace treaty, just an unbroken chain of crisis mode where knowledge, bloodlines, and even geography are treated as active battlefields. Why does Fishman Island have a poneglyph tying Joy Boy's promise to the destruction of the Red Line? Because as far as Emu is concerned, the map itself is an enemy combatant. And I want to emphasize how deep this war logic goes. The D-carriers, the Nefertari who refuse to move to Maria Joie, weird lines like Don Quixote, buccaneers, lunarians. These aren't just quirky ancestries, they're flagged as sleeper cells of the old world order. If you genuinely believe the ancient kingdom built a system that can reboot the seas, then every kid born with the wrong middle initial is basically a ticking warhead. Suddenly, genocidal policies, child experimentation, and mass-produced seraphim and pacifistas stop being cartoon evil and start looking like a terrified bureaucracy trying to build anti-D weapons fast enough to outrun a prophecy. People call the world government the victor of history, and, to be fair, on paper, they are. They wrote the textbooks, they drew the borders, they renamed the gods. But the way they act? They're the most scared faction on the planet. You don't erase a century, hunt down 30 stone tablets across the globe, and weaponize bloodlines unless some piece of your own intel says the ancient kingdom's plan is still ticking. Not might be, not old legend, but clock on the wall, specific deadline ticking. So what is that plan, and where is the timer hidden? If the poneglyph network is the instruction manual, is the one piece itself the execution key that finally flips the world back into Joy Boy's operating system? One piece as a world-scale update, the treasure as a system reboot. So if the one piece is the execution key, then we kind of have to stop imagining a treasure chest and start imagining a giant Update Windows Now pop-up for the planet. The world government spent 800 years installing antivirus on reality, and Laugh Tale is basically where Joy Boy left the uninstall wizard. Because as far as everything we've set up goes, the metaphor writes itself. Devil fruits are software, weird little reality apps that rewrite your body. Ancient energy is the power grid that used to run that software cleanly, without melting islands. The red line is a forced firewall slammed through the middle of the OS, segmenting the seas into 4 quarantine drives. So what is the one piece? Not gold, not even just truth. It's the coordinated mechanism that lets you revert or overwrite the world government's post-war configuration. Here's an interesting thing. Every big mystery keeps pointing to global toggles, not local prizes. Fishman Island's poneglyph ties Joy Boy's apology to the future destruction of the Red Line and the unification of the seas. Poseidon isn't just a talking fish. It's a root-level control over sea kings, the literal shipping infrastructure of the world. Pluton is a warship that's repeatedly framed like a continent buster. Uranus is just sitting up there radiating, "Please don't turn me on" energy. You don't build 3 planetary-scale tools unless your final project is also planetary. So, plausible functions. First, a device or protocol that reactivates ancient energy globally. Not just some battery in Shandora, but a proper restart of the old world grid. Suddenly, those forgotten terminals on the moon, the automata, the sun worship iconography stop being cute trivia and start looking like documentation. Second, a command sequence that unlocks or synchronizes the ancient weapons. Not press button, nuke celestial dragons, but align Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus into a controlled, shared system instead of 3 random nukes. And third, the big one, a geoengineering trigger that breaks or transforms the Red Line, reunites the seas, and basically deletes the firewall, to which I say, that's not a treasure, that's a patch note. Version 2.0, removed racism, added all blue. And to be fair, if you're the losing side in the Void Century, you don't get to push that update live. You get wiped, your kingdom gets turned into a taboo, and the winners rewrite the changelog. So Joy Boy and the Ancient Kingdom do the only thing they can. They time delay the briefing. Laugh Tale becomes a locked server containing ideology, history, and a literal how-to manual. The Kozuki clan builds poneglyphs as read-only drives scattered across the map. Only a future user with all the passwords, poneglyph literacy, ancient weapon allies, inherited wills, and a ship that can actually survive the endgame can log in and hit execute. I want to emphasize this. One Piece might be less about finding and more about being ready to press a button. That's why the story wastes so much time, allegedly, on freeing random islands, toppling warlords, awakening weird bloodlines, and turning ex-enemies into drinking buddies. It's compatibility testing. It's the OS checking. Are you the kind of pirate king who can press this and not turn the world into the Dark Universe timeline? So how do Luffy and the Straw Hats map onto those old-world roles in this reboot scenario? And which crewmate is secretly holding the metaphorical admin password? That's where we go next. Luffy as the New Age D, Joy Boy's user account reactivated. So let's start with the heresy. Luffy isn't chosen by fate. Luffy is what happens when an 800-year-old operating system finally finds the exact idiot it was coded for. Because as far as the old world's ideology goes, he's a perfect match. The Ancient Kingdom, as we've been building up, looks like a civilization obsessed with freedom of movement, open seas, and multiracial coexistence. No borders, no caste charts, just giants, fishmen, lunarians, random long-arm guys all hanging out on a supercontinent before the Red Line prison wall went up. Now, look at Luffy. His dream isn't rule the world. It's literally be the freest man on the sea. He doesn't care about laws, flags, or taxes. He cares that Nami isn't enslaved, that fishmen aren't treated like trash, that Robin isn't hunted for reading the OS manual. Here's an interesting thing. Every time Luffy punches a tyrant, the world calls it chaos, but from an ancient kingdom perspective, that's basic maintenance. The D people are the last surviving error in the world government's patch notes, and Luffy's particular D is wired with an instinctive hatred of oppression. He doesn't just topple kings, he decentralizes. Drum becomes a medical democracy. Alabasta reverts to a people-first monarchy. Fishman Island gets a shot at the surface. He walks in, deletes authoritarian admin rights, and walks out. Now, plug the Nika fruit into that. If devil fruits are software, Nika is not just a fun app, it's root access. Hito Hito no Mi, model Nikki, lets Luffy bend reality with cartoon physics, turn the environment into rubber, and scale his power off joy and imagination. That sounds goofy, to which I say, yes, obviously, that's the point. This is a biotech admin account designed by a civilization whose core value was make the world more playful and free. You want to lock that down with fear, hierarchy, and celestial dragon dress codes? The system literally stops responding. It only boots fully when someone laughs in the face of death. And, to be fair, this is where Joy Boy's ghost walks in. Joy Boy promised Fishman Island the destruction of the Red Line and a united sea, then failed. Luffy shows up, makes a blood pact with the Poseidon Line, protects fishmen and ancient races, and shrugs off world government borders like they're badly drawn filler arcs. He keeps reenacting Joy Boy's save file with different choices, siding with giants, sheltering Robin, punching world nobles. The pattern is too clean to be random. So, is Luffy destined? I want to emphasize, not in a mystical prophecy way, but in a user profile way. The ancient kingdom clearly played with lineage factors, D-carriers, and long-term genetics. They scatter poneglyphs, fruits, and bloodlines across a manufactured ocean prison, trusting that eventually someone with the right markers and behaviors, reckless empathy, joy under pressure, zero respect for imposed authority, will log in as Nika again. That's Luffy. He's the reactivated admin account, and if the captain is root access, what does that make the rest of the crew? Because the old world didn't run on one user alone. Next, we map how each straw hat quietly slots into a different subsystem the ancient kingdom left behind. The straw hats, as old world system admins, each role in the reboot. If Luffy is root access, the rest of the straw hats are the weirdly overqualified IT department pretending to be pirates. This isn't a crew, it's a patch note. Start with Nami. On the surface, she's just drawing maps and dodging taxes. But in an old-world frame, she's literally the navigator of the original sea layout and climate system. Her whole map the entire world thing sounds like a fun side quest, to which I say, why does the world government care so much about maps then? Because as far as the ancient kingdom goes, a unified, accurate world map is the control panel for a globe where the Red Line prison wall is gone and the seas are one continuous operating system again. Robin is even louder. She's not just a historian, she's the only user who can read the encrypted error logs, the poneglyphs that the Kozuki clan hard-coded specifically to bypass censorship. O'Haran scholars had already identified dozens of them before getting nuked off the map. Robin's dream to uncover the true history is basically the requirement doc, a record that can't be erased in the next purge cycle. Frankie? He is Pluton tech support. The blueprints are literally in his head. He's built a cyborg body off scrap, and then designs the Thousand Sunny as this hybrid of old-world ideas and modern craftsmanship. The Sunny isn't just a cool ship. It's a prototype client device for a rebooted planet. Self-sufficient power, lion-faced solar panels, ready-made to sail a world without Grand Line training wheels. Usopp looks like the odd one out. But here's an interesting thing. Every system needs a UI. His lies become myths that people later treat as real. He engineers morale in-universe and for us. In a world that just got its entire narrative of history replaced, you need a myth builder to steer how people emotionally log into the new reality. Chopper is the lineage factor and species medic. Vegapunk turned that into a weaponized science mess. Chopper's dream is the inverse, a medicine that can treat anyone, any race, any weird void century bloodline. That's the healthcare patch for a world where persecuted races like buccaneers and fishmen finally exist in the same open ecosystem. Sanji's All Blue is the logistics layer. Once the Red Line is destroyed and the seas unify, all ingredients can literally circulate. His dream is the supply chain spec for a planet where food isn't region-locked by a giant rock firewall. Brook is memory and time-spanning witness, a walking backup drive from the previous era, while Jinbe is the bridge protocol between surface politics and sea peoples, the guy who makes Joy Boy's promise to Fishman Island actually executable. I want to emphasize that's an entire restoration team. Oda has quietly assembled world admins under the guise of a gag pirate crew, and to be fair, that sounds dramatic. But when you line up their skills against the old world's missing systems, it reads like a job description. So zoom out with us next, because if this is the staff, what does the post-One Piece world they're rebooting actually look like? After the Red Line falls, predicting the post-reboot world map. So let's actually answer that zoom out, because as far as endgames go, Oda is not aiming for slightly better Marineford. He's aiming for a literal patch update to the planet. Remember that earlier ancient geography mess we talked about, where the Red Line Grand Line cross looks less like a natural continent and more like somebody dropped a plus-shaped prison bar on the ocean? Yeah. Let's bring that back. Here's an interesting thing. If the old world really was a more fluid, interconnected sea, then the current map is basically a weaponized UI. You take one continuous ocean, slam a 10,000-meter wall through it, then lace the equator with a climate blender called the Grand Line. Congratulations, you've just turned travel itself into a control system. The calm belts with their sea kings, that's your antivirus. The insane weather, firewalls, it's overkill. But the world government has never met a subtle solution it liked. So, what happens when that wall falls? Not metaphorically, literally. Fishman Island's poneglyph all but spells out that Joy Boy's promise involves the destruction or transformation of the Red Line. The cleanest scenario is not planet explodes, it's planet reboots. The Red Line gets shattered or perforated at key points. Reverse Mountain, Marie-Joie, maybe even under Fishman Island itself. So the four blues physically merge. The All Blue stops being Sanji's weird cooking myth and becomes the default state of the ocean. The calm belts? Once you restore whatever ancient energy grid the Great Kingdom was running, Uranus as a climate regulator, Pluton as tectonic control, Poseidon as Sea King traffic management, they either vanish or get tamed into normal seas. The Grand Line's weather stabilizes because the system that's been left on panic mode for 800 years finally gets turned back to not trying to kill you every 10 minutes. And to be fair, that does make the log pose look kind of embarrassing. Politically, That's an extinction-level event for the world government's business model. You can't choke trade at the red line if the red line is now beachfront property. You can't isolate kingdoms with fake maps when every ship can sail in a straight line. We'd see mass migrations, fishmen and merfolk moving up as the sun finally hits their homes, Sky Islanders descending once the seas aren't a death zone, extinct races like buccaneers and lunarians reclaiming surface space because the hunting grounds are gone. Power stops being this vertical thing, Gorosei at the top, celestial dragons in their bubble chairs, and turns horizontal. Local alliances, straw hat-style federations, shared charts, shared tech. And I want to emphasize, that doesn't kill adventure. It kills the idea that adventure is illegal. The real end of One Piece is the end of the age of pirates as we know it, not because mystery dies, but because forbidden seas stop existing, which is exactly why the world government is clinging to this cursed map like it's their last den mushi. Joy Boy called it a dawn because from their perspective, a sunrise is a system crash. And if this is the rebooted map, next we need to ask, who actually gets admin rights to that new world? The moral of the old world, why erasing history, was the final weapon. Who actually gets admin rights? According to the world government, the answer is no one ever. Stop asking questions, which is a bold IT policy for a planet. And here's an interesting thing. Every time somebody so much as jiggles the mouse on that locked old world account, the response is not a warning pop-up. It's a buster call. Look at the pattern. O'Hara doesn't build a battleship, they build a bibliography. Their big crime is literally connecting dots between poneglyphs, and the government drops a nuke on a library. Roger decodes the same story, laughs at the ending, and suddenly he mysteriously dies right when it's most politically useful. Whitebeard gets close enough to shout the spoiler on live TV, and the Marines throw the entire Navy, 3 admirals, and a magma war criminal at an old man on life support. Now Luffy's sailing around with Robin, Poseidon's reincarnation, multiple D's, and an actual Nika fruit, and the response is Imu pressing the ancient laser pointer on entire islands. As far as threat assessment goes, they're telling us the quiet part very loud. Information is scarier than Uranus, because what did the Great Kingdom really leave behind? Yeah, we have Pluton's blueprints, Poseidon's bloodline, some vague sky laser called Uranus, cool, but the actually dangerous ancient weapon is a story, a recorded, distributed memory of a different world system, etched into poneglyphs, baked into lineage factors, maybe even gamified into devil fruits that keep spawning weirdos who don't fit the current order. You don't erase a century of history just because some guy had a big boat. I want to emphasize how petty that makes the winners look. The D reads less like a cool mystery initial and more like banned citizenship, an error code the world rewrite couldn't fully delete. The poneglyphs are unburnable hard drives. The Kazuki clan literally invented stone USB sticks because paper kept getting genocided. The Straw Hats are the worst-case scenario for the regime, a walking proof of concept that inherited will, curiosity, and the urge to connect will outlive any Marineford-sized flex. And here's the contrarian flip. We talk about the void century like the Great Kingdom lost, to which I say, if your shiny new empire has to spend 800 years panicking about a spoiler leak, maybe you weren't the real winner. The ancient kingdom forced their enemies into the most exhausting PR campaign in history. Every D that laughs, every island that guards a poneglyph, every fishman still waiting on Joy Boy's promise, is the old world going, You can delay the patch. You can't cancel the update. So what do we do with that, as readers? We're not just watching Luffy fight bosses. We're watching a story about how stories themselves are power. If their final weapon was a memory of another way to live, our call to action is pretty simple. Pay attention, talk about it. Don't let the fun pirate cartoons ideas about freedom and history get quietly filed under just fiction. And if that's the moral, next we need to ask, when this buried story finally boots up, what kind of world is it trying to load? Rapid-fire recap, the old world in 12 moves. So let's actually speedrun everything we've built so far, and see if it still stands up when we compress it into one brain-friendly package. 12 moves, one old world, and if your head doesn't hurt a little by the end, to which I say, give it a minute. Move 1, the ancient kingdom, not a vague fairy tale nation, but an open, high-tech super-civilization running circles around everyone else. Think less random lost city, and more Joy Boy's global startup campus with weather control, sky islands on speed dial, and a culture so contagious the future world government literally had to nuke the memory of it. Move 2, ancient energy. That weird, clean, everywhere-at-once power grid that Vegapunk is basically reinventing with worse branding. We're talking a system that can feed Sky Island dials, light up Egghead, and probably fuel Uranus without anyone needing to burn a single log pose. Move 3, lineage factors and devil fruits as intentional biosoftware. Somebody in that old world looked at DNA and said, what if we just install powers? Zoans, Paramecia, Logia, all as plug-and-play apps on the human operating system. Because as far as we can tell, the real curse is running unauthorized software in a world that forgot the user manual. Move 4, the will of D, not a cute middle initial, but a banned political identity. The last surviving error in the world government's rewrite of reality, carried by people whose very existence keeps trying to reboot Joy Boy's promise. Move 5, the ancient weapons as geopolitical deterrents. Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus. Not random doomsday toys, but mutually assured don't you dare buttons that made the old world's balance of power work, right up until it didn't. Move 6, the Red Line and Grand Line as an engineered post-war cage. The current map is a prison built on top of a shattered supercontinent, locking cultures in, splitting seas, and weaponizing the weather so hard that just sailing in a straight line became a personality test. Move 7, the world government as a permanent wartime regime that forgot how to stop mobilizing. 800 years later, they're still in emergency mode, still burning libraries, still treating archaeology like terrorism. Move 8, Imu and the Gorose as custodians of a very fragile lie. Their job isn't ruling, it's patching holes in the narrative every time a poneglyph, a D, or a giant elephant with Wi-Fi shows up. And to be fair, they've been terrifyingly good at it. Move 9, the poneglyphs as distributed backups of the old world. OS Kozuki-coded, indestructible, scattered across Alabasta, Skypia, Fishman Island, Wano. Little stone USB sticks saying, please restore from backup. Move 10, the One Piece as a coordinated reboot package. Not just treasure, but the installer that only works once enough. Poneglyph data is reassembled, and the right people are standing in the right place. Move 11, Luffy and the Straw Hats as the designed restoration team, whether they know it or not. Their root, their allies, their weird magnetism for ancient tech and oppressed nations, it all looks suspiciously like someone preloaded a patch file into the story's main character. Move 12, The future world map as a return to open seas and shared history. Red line gone, Fishman Island risen, sky and sea back in dialogue, the sun god no longer a slur, but a syllabus. Here's an interesting thing. You can test this 12-step model against basically any major arc. Alabasta's civil war wrapped around a poneglyph, Skypia's Sky Island fossil of ancient energy, Eni's Lobby's judicial slaughterhouse protecting the lie, Dressrosa's lineage factor toy factory, Wano's Kozuki Code and Pluton Key. Does it all suddenly look like old world fallout to you too, or are we just a mess with a microphone? I want to emphasize, if this model holds, the way we watch the rest of One Piece should change. And the next part is where we start stress testing it against the endgame. How this changes rereads, spotting old world echoes in every arc. So if the whole world suddenly looks like old world fallout, what do we actually do with that besides feel very smart and very unemployed? We weaponize it. We turn every arc into a little void century crime scene. And to be fair, this is where rereads get stupidly fun. Here's an interesting thing. You can run a super simple old world checklist on literally any arc. 4 questions, 1 brain cell. First, what piece of ancient tech or ideology is being echoed here? Second, which bloodlines or Ds are on stage? Third, how does the local government mirror or resist the post-void century world government structure? And fourth, what does the geography tell you about pre-war versus post-war design? That's it. That's the system. You can slap this on Orangetown if you really want. Take Skypia. On a first read, it's Luffy punches Lightning Man, to which I say, yes, cinema, but also old world simulator. Ancient energy abuse? Check. We've got Shandora's Golden City, a giant beanstalk plugged into the sky, and a god complex weaponizing natural forces. Erased history? The poneglyph literally sitting under a bell that nobody rings anymore. The geography screams, this used to be part of a normal continent before the world got shattered and propped up on a man-made map. Eni's Lobby? Run the checklist. Tech and ideology. A permanent day island built as a judicial theme park where justice is a conveyor belt into oblivion. Bloodlines. Nico Robin, last survivor of O'Haran scholars who almost mapped all the poneglyphs. Government mirror. It's the world government's brain stem, a literal gateway into the world's memory prison at Impel Down. Geography. An island with a hole in the middle surrounded by waterfalls, like someone punched through the planet and then built bureaucracy around the wound. Fishman Island is a holding pattern, ancient tech and ideology. Poseidon is literally living there, waiting for the world map patch notes to drop. Joy Boy's apology. Poneglyph turns the whole arc into a time delay old world quest. The racial tension isn't just racism flavor text, because as far as Oda's patterns go, rare or persecuted races are almost always void century survivors. Dressrosa? That's a devil fruit and bloodline experiment gone wrong under a celestial dragon affiliate, with toys as walking lineage factor redactions. I want to emphasize, on reread, treat poneglyph mentions, weird weather, and racial tensions as old world clues, not just quirky world building. The calm belt, the red line, random islands with impossible climates, those all red like scars from when someone manually re-engineered the seas. Every time a buccaneer, Lunarian, or giant variant shows up, assume the void century is photobombing the scene. So here's the game. Pick one arc, any arc. Alabasta, Thriller Bark, Whole Cake, whatever's rotting in your memory. Rewatch or reread it with the old world checklist in hand. Note the tech echo, the bloodlines, the government structure, the geography scars. See what suddenly clicks, then come back, because next we're going to stress test this lens against the actual endgame pieces on the board and see which theories survive impact. Why Old World Lore Matters. The real dawn of One Piece. Which is funny, because as far as the world government is concerned, that exact kind of overthinking is the real crime. Here's an interesting thing. When you strip away all the ancient weapons, lineage factors, and galaxy brain map theories, the old world is just the Straw Hat story scaled up to planet size. Found family? That's literally the ancient kingdom trying to build a coalition of races the future calls extinct. Freedom? That's a civilization betting everything on poneglyphs, so some nerds 800 years later can bypass censorship. Laughing in the face of impossible odds? That's Joy Boy making a promise to fishmen under a continent-sized rock ceiling and going, "Yeah, we'll break the sky later." People say, "Isn't this all too big, too abstract?" To which I say, this is just Luffy versus Arlong, but the ocean itself is the park. Nika's goofy, rubbery dance is the same energy as the ancient kingdom turning their entire history into indestructible graffiti out of spite. The Void Century isn't a detached lore file. It's the emotional beats we liked from Episode 1, written into tectonic plates and bloodlines. And to be fair, the dawn of the world sounds like a dramatic calendar update until you realize it's also a metaphor for us right now, reading this series. What happens when people recover erased stories, question inherited systems, and imagine alternatives? You get O'Hara quietly mapping 30 poneglyphs under the nose of the biggest military on Earth. You get fishmen clinging to a stone that says, "The red line will fall, the seas will unite," like a prophecy of collective jailbreak. You get every extinct race, Buccaneers, Lunarians, Giants variants, standing in for any group history tried to delete. The Void Century is what it feels like when powerful people hit delete on the parts of the past that make them look bad. The dawn is what happens when those receipts resurface anyway. Sound familiar at all? I want to emphasize, you do not need every theory we tossed around to be right to enjoy this. Half of this old-world framework will probably age like Sanji's early Wanted poster, and that's part of the fun. Because as far as this series is concerned, One Piece is a living, evolving puzzle. Every new chapter either confirms some tiny suspicion you had about, say, the world map being a man-made prison, or it absolutely nukes your mental model and forces a delightful rewrite. Both outcomes are a win. So, if you like this kind of brain rot, stick around. We're going to keep revisiting this old-world mess every time Oda drops a new poneglyph, a weird race, or an SBS answer that casually rewrites cosmology in a footnote. We'll update the timeline, break the map again, and see how close we are to the real shape of that lost super-civilization. Because if the world government is scared of people learning the truth, then every time you pause to think about One Piece lore, you're already doing Joy Boy's work.